Good evening, night owls, and welcome to Whisper Crowley. Tonight, I will guide you into a world of darkness, hoping to help you relax and unwind. Perhaps some of you will even drift into a haunting yet soothing sleep. Before we begin, let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you. And now, we begin. This happened just a month ago. We were in the middle of January, and around here, it was snowing almost every day, always heavily. I work as an external security guard at a warehouse on the outskirts of the city, and the snow definitely doesn't help make the job more pleasant. Fortunately, the company allows me to stay inside on snowy days, but that makes the shift drag even more. Instead of walking around the building, I stand at the glass doors at the entrance, watching for any movement. That night, I started my shift at 9, locking everything up after the employees left. The snow was falling heavily outside, so I stayed inside, standing near the door, just trying to stay awake. There was nothing to see except the snow, occasional lightning, and the rumble of thunder. The hours passed. During this time, I leaned against the wall and went to the bathroom a few times. But then, as I struggled to stay awake near the door, I heard a deep rumble. The sound echoed through the entire warehouse, like metal bending or a heavy door scraping as it opened. It was enough to make the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I thought it was just a scary sound caused by the situation. But after all, it was my job to check. I walked down the main corridor, taking a look at the side corridors. I didn't know the warehouse very well, since I usually stayed outside. I only knew that there was a central corridor, with 5 or 6 other corridors, leading to large storage areas. I checked each one until I reached the last one. At the end, the door was ajar. I felt a chill down my spine, even without knowing if it had been like that before. I went there and pushed the door open. The room was completely dark. "Hello?" my voice echoed through the silent warehouse. After a few seconds, I began to back away and close the door until I heard something. A sound coming from the darkness. It was a voice. It sounded like someone mumbling or laughing softly between the tall shelves. "Is someone there?" "What are you doing here?" I shouted. "Come here," said the voice, almost in a whisper. "What? Come here," the voice said a little louder. I still couldn't see anything. After a few seconds, I closed the door, grabbed the radio, and called the police, leaving through the main entrance. 5 minutes later, they arrived and searched the building. They emerged without finding anyone. The security cameras showed what appeared to be a man in his 50s with a dark jacket, sneaking through one of the back gates. He entered the room where I heard him, and disturbingly, in the footage, he seemed to be holding a knife. He left right after I left the building. We never discovered what he wanted there, or what he intended by calling me into the warehouse. It might seem cowardly, but I quit after that and found a day job. I just couldn't shake the feeling that if I had stepped further into that dark room, I might never have walked out again. The police report suggested he was likely a drifter seeking shelter from the storm. But the knife and the way he called me inside have always made me question that explanation. What haunts me most is the casual, almost playful way he called out to me, as if it were all some kind of game to him. The warehouse manager later told me they found some personal items arranged in a corner of that storage room. A worn blanket, some food wrappers, and oddly, several newspaper clippings about the warehouse and the company. It appeared someone had been living there, or at least spending significant time inside, possibly for weeks before I encountered them. I sometimes wonder what would have happened if I had called out to my supervisor instead of investigating alone, or if the power hadn't gone out that night. Would I have ever known someone was hiding in the building? Or would they have continued living there, watching us work day after day, waiting for another opportunity? The police increased patrols in the industrial area after that incident, and the company upgraded their security system. But I still drive past that warehouse sometimes on my way to my new job, and I can't help but slow down and stare at the back gates, wondering if anyone else found their way inside. I hope you enjoyed the first story. If you did, don't forget to leave a like. But if I didn't do my job well, feel free to give it a thumbs down. Either way, drop a comment and let us know where you're listening from and what time it is for you. Now, let's continue. This happened 2 years ago, right around the end of February, when snow usually makes its appearance in my area. I live in a small, one-bedroom apartment with my dog, Cooper. It's not the best place in the world, but it's also far from being the worst. My neighbors are mostly quite reserved, and since the building has only 2 floors with 8 apartments, it never gets too crowded. That night, I got home from work around 6:30, took a quick walk with Cooper, then prepared dinner and sat down at the table to play video games with some friends online. I ended up staying awake longer than I had planned, but around midnight, I decided to stop. The sun had long since set, and I didn't even bother turning on the lights in the apartment. The only glow came from my computer screen, illuminating the room in the darkness. When I decided it was time to sleep, I put Cooper's leash on and went downstairs with him to the backyard so he could do his business. It was very cold outside, and the ground was already covered with snow. This yard was right behind the building and had only a few lamps that illuminated small areas here and there. Everything was very quiet, but as I waited for Cooper to sniff around, I looked up at the window of my apartment. The blinds were partially open, and I could see the light from the computer screen shining through the glass. Suddenly, something moved. I noticed that the light passing through the blinds intensified, as if something had blocked it for a moment. "What the hell?" I mumbled breathlessly, completely caught off guard. I looked again to make sure it was indeed my window, but I knew it was. After all, I could clearly see my computer. My mind began to race. Someone was behind the window and moved away when they realized I was looking. It was the only explanation that made sense for something to have moved like that. I pulled Cooper's leash and, without wasting time, went back into the building and up the stairs to the second floor. I looked down the hallway and slowly approached my apartment, alert to any sound. It's worth mentioning that I never lock the door when I go out with Cooper, since I'm usually gone for less than a minute. Still, it seemed unlikely that someone would have simply entered my apartment. I opened the door. At first glance, everything seemed to be in order. The small dog gate I leave near the entrance was still exactly in place. I took a few steps inside. It was still dark, but the main room appeared empty. I turned and looked at the hallway that leads to my bedroom. The darkness was so intense that I couldn't even see the door at the end. To be honest, I began to doubt myself. Maybe it was just fatigue, and I was overreacting, thinking the air conditioner might have turned on and moved the blinds a bit. I was about to go to the bedroom to check if everything was okay when I noticed that Cooper had stopped next to the entrance door. I looked at him, and he was staring fixedly at the hallway, growling in a low, contained way, something I had never seen him do before. I called his name, but he didn't even look at me. His eyes remained locked on the hallway. I followed his gaze, and only then began to distinguish a figure at the end of the corridor. In the shadows, I could see the slight outline of someone standing there. The only thing truly visible were the open eyes, staring directly into mine. My body reacted by instinct, and I ran outside, holding Cooper. I went to the front of the building and stayed there with him while I called the police and waited for them to arrive. My heart only calmed down when they finally arrived. They entered the apartment and soon came out with a handcuffed man. The guy didn't even try to escape. It seems he had hidden in my bedroom and was found there. He was a middle-aged man and appeared to be ill. He refused to explain what he was doing there. What bothers me most about this story is thinking about the exact moment he entered my apartment. I took Cooper out as soon as I arrived and then again before going to sleep. And those were the only 2 times I left the door unlocked. I saw him through the window before going to sleep, but I have no way of knowing if that was exactly when he entered. He could have been inside my apartment for more than 6 hours, hidden in my bedroom. Whatever the case, I was lucky to have Cooper with me that night. Things could have ended much worse without him. The police later told me that the man had a history of breaking into homes and watching people sleep. He had been released from a psychiatric facility just 3 weeks earlier, against the recommendations of his doctors. In his backpack, they found a notebook with addresses, including mine, as well as photos of people, including some of me walking Cooper taken from a distance. The idea that he had been watching me, planning his intrusion, and that I only caught him by chance still gives me chills. I've moved twice since then, and now have a much more elaborate security system. Cooper sleeps right next to my bed every night. Some people ask why I keep a baseball bat under my bed, but after what happened, I'm not taking any chances. Some experiences change how you see safety forever. I never thought something like this would happen to me. You hear about these stories on the news, see them in movies, but you never imagine becoming the protagonist in your own nightmare. I was 25 when I quit my soul-crushing job at a marketing firm in Seattle. Each morning, I'd drag myself to that miserable cubicle, feeling a piece of my spirit drain away with every spreadsheet I completed. So one rainy Tuesday, I walked into my manager's office and quit on the spot. No 2 weeks notice, nothing. Just the liberating words, "I'm done." Within days, I'd booked a solo trip to Thailand. I needed something drastic, something to shake me out of the corporate stupor I'd fallen into. I packed light, just essentials in a weathered backpack, and boarded a plane to Bangkok, eager for adventure. The hostel I'd reserved online was exactly as the reviews described. Dingy, with questionable hygiene standards, but dirt cheap. Perfect for stretching my meager savings. After a 20-hour flight, I collapsed onto the thin mattress, hoping sleep would help with the brutal jet lag. I woke around 5 in the morning. My mind was racing, making further sleep impossible. I grabbed my backpack and headed out to explore. The streets were just coming alive. Vendors setting up food stalls, motorcycles zipping by, the air thick with humidity and the scent of spices. All the travel blogs I'd read raved about Thai street food, so finding breakfast became my mission. But the early hour meant few places were open. I wandered the gradually awakening streets, feeling the occasional stare from locals, uncomfortable with being so obviously foreign and alone. Around 2 in the afternoon, I found a vendor selling mangosteen, a fruit I'd never tried before. I bought a few and sat down nearby to taste them. The flavor was incredible, but after a few bites, something felt wrong. A wave of nausea hit me, followed by intense dizziness. I tried to stand, thinking walking might help, but my legs gave out. I fell back to the curb and called for help, panic rising as I felt consciousness slipping away. Just before my eyes closed, I saw people gathering around me. A car door opened and several men approached. That's when everything went black. I woke up in what looked like a decent hotel room. There were 2 beds, a large flat-screen TV, and a window overlooking the city, too high up for any escape attempt. I scanned the room for others, but couldn't see the door from my position beside a dresser. "Is anyone there?" I called out. "Be quiet. He'll hear you. Better if he thinks you're still unconscious," a woman's voice responded, though I couldn't see her. "Who is he?" I asked desperately. "Please stay quiet. We'll both be in trouble if you keep talking." I stopped, confused and terrified, but understanding the message. When someone warns you that making noise could lead to harm, you listen. My hands were tied behind my back. I twisted, trying to free myself, making soft thumping sounds, until I heard footsteps approaching from the bathroom. Just before the door opened, the woman warned me, "Pretend you're still asleep. He only likes to play when you're awake." I closed my eyes and tried to control my breathing, but her words made my heart race like never before. Sitting on that hotel floor, I wished with every fiber of my being that I'd never quit my job. I'd rather endure 1,000 mind-numbing days in that cubicle than be here, wondering if I was about to be tortured or killed. The bathroom door opened. Heavy footsteps vibrated through the floor, coming closer. I wanted to scream when a hand landed on my shoulder. He shook me hard, but I kept my eyes firmly shut, continuing to feign unconsciousness. He shook me harder until it began to hurt, but I was determined to survive, determined never to discover what that woman meant by play if I opened my eyes. His hand left my shoulder when he realized I wouldn't wake. I knew he would go after her next. He moved away from me, and I heard him begin to shake her violently. She couldn't maintain the pretense and let out a pain-filled scream. I couldn't resist and opened one eye to see what was happening. The man was large, tall, and muscular, and fear paralyzed me as I watched him carry her away. She seemed small, fragile, and mistreated, giving the impression she'd been there a long time. As he took her to the bathroom, her back to him, she looked into my eyes and silently mouthed 2 words. "Get out." The door closed behind them, and as I heard her begging him not to hurt her, a lump formed in my throat. Then loud music started playing behind the door, and I knew that if I had any chance of escape, it would be now. With effort, I managed to stand by bracing my back against the wall and sliding upward. Once on my feet, I approached the door as silently as possible. There was a latch, and I'd have one chance to open it and run for my life. I didn't know if the man would hear the door opening over the music, but if he could, I'd need to act fast. I gripped the latch with my teeth and turned it until I heard a click. Then I turned and grabbed the doorknob with my still-bound hands behind my back. The knob turned and the door opened. That's when the music in the bathroom suddenly stopped, and I knew I needed to run. The bathroom door opened, and the man started shouting. I bolted down the corridor and managed to get into an elevator. Inside were people who stared at me with wide eyes. I begged for help, pleaded for someone to call the police, but none of them seemed to understand what I was saying. The elevator reached the lobby, and I ran straight to the reception desk. Fortunately, someone there understood me. They helped untie the ropes around my wrists and put me in an office at the back, where I waited for about 20 minutes until local authorities arrived. I was interrogated by several officers who struggled with English. I led them to the room where I'd been held captive, but when they opened the door and searched the place, the man and woman had vanished. In that moment, my heart broke, not for myself, but for her. I desperately wanted to help her. She had been so frightened, so broken. I genuinely believed she was still there, and that perhaps I could have done something for her. The police found my backpack in one of the drawers, and basically told me I was free to go. There would be no investigation because, apparently, there was no evidence. The hotel had no security cameras, and they couldn't proceed with just my word. I went directly from the hotel to the airport and caught the first flight back home. When I arrived, I stayed with my parents for a long time. I left my apartment and spent over a year too terrified to even leave the house. I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, that woman's face returned to my mind. I tried reaching out to authorities in my home country, but they also said there was nothing they could do, and I felt completely helpless. I wish I could say that eventually my life improved, that I learned something from this experience. But that would be a lie. I developed debilitating anxiety. I can barely function outside my home. I only started doing my own grocery shopping last year. I'm 28 now and still live with my parents. I work from home in a role that requires no human interaction. I should have kept that monotonous job and lived a life without excitement. Anything would be better than the hell I'm living now. I was the manager of a motel when it happened. It was past 1 in the morning, and no new guests had checked in for hours. It seemed like a quiet night. I was chatting with one of the staff about how whenever the night is this calm and silent, something bad tends to happen. They told me I was being superstitious, but I noticed that most of the time I was right. During my 10 years as manager, I'd witnessed many things: domestic arguments, hallway brawls, drug deals gone wrong, and the list just keeps growing. But that night surpassed all the others. Around 1:30 in the morning, after my colleagues finally finished telling me how much I was exaggerating about the calmness, I received a call from one of the rooms. When I answered, a child's voice greeted me. It sounded like a little boy, maybe 5 years old, asking for his mother and saying I needed to go get her. I asked if he was okay, and he said yes, but insisted he wanted his mother. Concern began to rise, and just as I was about to ask which room he was calling from, a man took over the call, identifying himself as the child's father and apologizing for the disturbance. Before I could respond, the line went dead. Our system was outdated, so we couldn't identify which room the call came from. I felt a bit uneasy, so I asked my staff if anyone remembered a man checking in with a small boy. I had no luck until I asked the restaurant manager, who recalled a man entering with a little boy earlier that night, and using the key card we give to all guests. Fortunately, only one key card had been used that day, and it showed the room number. I called one of the stronger staff members and went to the room. I had no intention of confronting the man or asking questions. I just wanted to see the boy and make sure everything was okay. I grabbed some towels, asked my colleague to wait at the end of the corridor, and knocked on the door. A man answered. He was short, heavy-set, and reeked of alcohol. Behind him, I saw the little boy lying on the bed. He was so thin that his ribs were visible, and he appeared to be covered in bruises. I tried to stay calm and told the man I'd brought the towels he had requested. As expected, he denied asking for towels and simply closed the door in my face. I turned and hurried down the corridor to the elevator. As soon as I got back to reception, I called the police without hesitation. They instructed me to act normally and avoid any additional contact with the man, so he wouldn't try to flee with the boy. My heart was racing, and I was sweating profusely while waiting for the police to arrive. They surrounded the building and entered in force. I informed them of the room number and handed over the key, and they asked me to accompany them in case there was any trouble accessing the room. Though I didn't want to go back up, I knew if it could help the boy, it would be worth it. The elevator ride seemed endless, my mind filling with possible scenarios of what was about to happen. When it finally stopped, the 8 officers and I exited and walked down the corridor. They asked me to wait near the end of the hallway while they approached the door. My heart raced as I watched them knock and demand the man come out. The man refused and threatened to hurt the boy if they tried to enter. At that moment, I felt the weight of the situation and believed his threat. The police tried to negotiate for nearly an hour, but he remained firm, determined not to come out. Finally, they decided to breach the room. It was as if time had slowed down. I heard screams mixed with the sounds of objects breaking inside, and soon after, the officers came out with the man in handcuffs. Behind them, another officer ran with the boy in his arms. He could barely hold his head up and was rushed to an ambulance. Later, I learned that he recovered completely and was reunited with his mother that morning. That floor of the motel was cordoned off during the investigation, and I later found out that the man with the boy was indeed his father. Apparently, his wife was divorcing him and planning to take their son because of his abusive behavior. In response, he took the boy and threatened to hurt him if she left. They had been on the run for over a month. Sadly, it was also discovered that the father didn't hesitate to mistreat his own son, and the bruises were the result of beatings he justified as punishment for making a mess. I spent days crying for that boy. I wanted so badly to ease his pain and erase the memories of what his father had put him through. But I know that's a kind of trauma he'll have to deal with for the rest of his life. I'm just grateful he got help, and that his mother can sleep peacefully, knowing her son is safe by her side. In late summer of 2018, a sinister rumor began spreading across the internet, first emerging from the darkest corners of obscure forums like 4chan, and then seeping into specific sections of more mainstream platforms like Reddit, Facebook, and Twitter. A mysterious group of militants who called themselves the Vigilantes claimed to have captured several ISIS fighters. Furthermore, they announced their intentions to beat, torture, and eventually execute them in a live broadcast via an obscure site on the dark web. On a monochromatic, hastily constructed website, the group published a disturbing statement about their intentions. We are operating 24 hours a day. We are in a war zone and have urgent matters to resolve, but we will meet the deadline. Prepare yourself for thrilling games and torture, all interactive and completely free. We guarantee the first hour will be appropriate for all ages. The statement continued, "We will explicitly warn you before the situation becomes violent, but under no circumstances will we stop the torture. It must end in death. Red rooms are heavy business that few can stomach. This also means more attention and annoyance for us. But one thing is certain, we will make movie stars out of them." The rumors spread quickly, and soon secondary sources like the subreddits r/deepweb and rtor began a countdown to the promised stream. The number of followers on these subreddits grew substantially, but most users weren't there out of a genuine desire for violence. They were, above all, driven by curiosity. They wanted definitive, incontestable proof that the darkest legends about the deep web were indeed real. At its core, the dark web, or deep web, as some prefer to call it, is actually a relatively small collection of sites that cannot be searched and are almost impossible to trace. As you might imagine, this makes the dark web an attractive place for those interested in illicit markets. However, according to some, the anonymity offered by Tor browsers and Onion routers also attracts a very different type of predator. There are rumors about fight clubs with paying observers. Other reports promise to transform an adult woman into a kind of living doll, where she is wrapped in a restrictive latex suit and subjected to frightening methods of physical torture. But among all the legends circulating about the dark web, the so-called red rooms are perhaps the most disturbing. They say that somewhere in the deepest corners of the dark web, people broadcast live, interactive executions of innocent victims, often hand-picked. Do red rooms really exist? It's an annoyingly common question, said Eileen Ormsby, an Australian journalist who has dedicated years to studying the dark web and its phenomena. How can I access the deepest levels of the deep web? Where is the really dark stuff? Well, the answer is quite simple. That darker side people talk about simply doesn't exist. Ormsby quickly points out that in some cases, crimes against humanity have already been broadcast live on the dark web, but not of the red room variety. It's said that the infamous Australian child abuser Peter Scully first broadcast the disturbing Daisy's Destruction live on the dark web to a select audience of paying customers, and only later sold it for $10,000 per copy. However, when it comes to the existence of actual red rooms for live executions, Ormsby asserts that the idea is absurd. The FBI has already dealt with cases on the dark web related to child exploitation, kidnapping, drug trafficking, and even contract killings. But as Ormsby argues, if red rooms really exist, why have they never been investigated? And if they were real, why has no proven screenshot ever surfaced on the surface web? It's worth noting that, around the early 2010s, when the first rumors about red rooms began circulating, a new trend of short horror stories was also gaining traction on the internet. Inspired by the popularity of so-called copypastas, texts replicated on the web with humor or provocation, creepypastas emerged as horror stories that users copied and pasted onto profiles and pages. Stories like those of Jeff the Killer, Candle Cove, Smile Dog, and the infamous Slenderman circulated on almost every forum and social network. Slenderman in particular was so successful that it ended up generating spin-offs like movies, documentaries, and games to meet the growing demand for this type of content. To cater to this demand, Reddit users created a forum called No Sleep, exclusively dedicated to creepypastas produced by amateur writers. However, as the collection of these short and often ambiguous horror stories grew, a rather curious phenomenon emerged. It all started when a No Sleep subscriber asked the innocent question, "Is this story real?" Most responses were logical. "Probably not. This seems like fiction." Others, however, defended the possibility that the story was true. But as soon as the idea that No Sleep was a creative writing forum became established, interest in the posts diminished. Instead of letting interest naturally extinguish, the moderators made the surprising decision to remove any post or comment that mentioned the words fiction, creative writing, or even story. At first glance, this rigid intervention could have ruined a space dedicated to free expression. However, the effect was the opposite. The number of subscribers to the forum jumped to 1 million, then 7 million. And today No Sleep boasts more than 17 million individual users, visitors, and contributors. No Sleep visitors and contributors loved the moderator's effort to create an online space where the line between lie and truth became indistinguishable. The forum is so popular precisely because its users appreciate this chance to suspend disbelief. They get excited by the idea that such extraordinary stories might have a grain of truth. Many even wish they were real, in the same way that some openly or secretly get excited by the idea that red rooms might exist in some dark corner of the dark web. Interestingly, a British hacker known as SH4D0W claimed to have found several red rooms while browsing the dark web. But instead of the macabre spectacles that were promised, he discovered they were all scams. "I decided to explore the servers of these rooms," he recounted, "to verify where they were located. But I noticed they had less security than the average corporate laptop. I found it strange that an allegedly illicit network would have so little concern for security. So I continued investigating. Soon after, I confirmed it was a scam. Users were charged absurd amounts to access the red room, and when they did, they found a countdown clock indicating when the show would begin. But when it reached 0, the page loaded, and there was absolutely nothing. Sometimes an error message appeared, other times a blank screen, but never a live broadcast or any snuff film. Remember the ISIS red room mentioned earlier? The same thing happened there. The trolls who created the site promised a series of terrible punishments for their captives, But when the video finally aired, it was 21 minutes of nothing. At the end, the broadcast showed a clean-shaved prisoner being forced to eat cooked bacon. They promised a snuff film. In the end, it was just a scene of forced lunch. The site ended up being replaced, with a notice claiming it had been seized as part of a joint operation by authorities. However, the notice seemed amateurish. A few days later, a similar site emerged, but once again it turned out to be a complete hoax. The absence of solid evidence about red rooms has led some to believe they are nothing more than urban legends. Still, in the summer of 2020, two 17-year-old Italian teenagers were arrested on suspicion of having paid to access an online execution room. After a 10-month investigation conducted by the Carabinieri of Siena, in cooperation with the juvenile prosecutor of Florence, it was discovered that the site the young men tried to access was called Hell of Horrors and contained thousands of rooms, chats, blogs, and showcases displaying every imaginable atrocity. The teenagers were apparently released without charges, but their arrest demonstrates that at least some government agencies take the threat of red rooms seriously. And honestly, this shouldn't be surprising. The concept of red rooms has existed for over 100 years. In 1894, H.G. Wells published a short story with the same title about a haunted room inside an old Gothic castle. The term red room was also used to describe a room in a haunted house in the 1977 book, The Amityville Horror, and later became the name of the BDSM room of the protagonist in 50 Shades of Grey. In 1999, Japanese filmmaker Daisuke Yamanouchi released his horror film called Red Room. This version comes much closer to the current idea of red rooms, involving prisoners who must choose cards to determine what kind of torture they'll suffer, who will apply it, and who will be the next victim. The tortures start relatively light, but quickly escalate to levels of extreme and sadistic abuse. As you can see, red rooms are not a recent idea. When they became an internet legend, the term had already been associated with places where dark things happen for more than a century. But perhaps the most frightening aspect of red rooms is the possibility that they really do exist, and the fact that we cannot clearly distinguish between what happens on the dark web and what is merely rumor. Some parts of society have created online spaces so distant from reality that truth itself has become something malleable. If we all believe that red rooms exist, then according to some philosophical concepts, they come to exist, albeit in a more abstract form. Red rooms have indeed entered the collective consciousness, and human history is full of examples of imaginary ideas that were brought into reality. This means that perhaps it's only a matter of time until society takes such a terrifying and mythical concept and transforms it into a frightening reality. To give you an idea, I'm not exactly a small woman. I stand over 5 feet 10 inches tall and weigh around 200 pounds. A good portion of that weight is pure muscle, which in theory wouldn't make me an easy target. But even though I've always told myself this, reality can be quite different. After all, in the eyes of someone with bad intentions, a woman is still a woman, and at that moment, I was in the wrong place at the wrong time. He wanted something I had, and I don't think I need to go into details for you to understand. Although I generally work from home, from time to time, I need to take a company refresher course, just so they can ensure I'm keeping up to date and following work progress. It might seem unnecessary for someone with 10 years of experience like me, but I understand it's part of the process to keep everything running smoothly. If I need to give up a weekend every 6 months, I try not to complain. Usually they put me up in a decent hotel and provide meal vouchers, so it's not a big deal. But this time, when I received the email saying I had to take the course, I wasn't at all excited to discover I would need to drive to the city during a storm. It was about a 3-hour drive, and even without rain, it would already be a tiring journey. But it was something I needed to do. The journey ended up being much longer. I took almost twice the expected time, driving at a slower speed than would probably be necessary, but I preferred to arrive safely. When I finally reached my destination, I felt relieved, albeit completely exhausted. The rain continued to fall heavily, almost as if following me. My mood plummeted when I saw that instead of a hotel, I was standing in front of a questionable-looking, poorly maintained motel. There were some suspicious figures at the entrance, and every fiber of my being rejected the idea of spending the night there. But it was already 10 o'clock at night, and I had no other viable alternative. I entered the small room that in any other place would be called reception, but calling that a lobby would be an affront to real lobbies. It was just a small room with a man sitting in an armchair, a laptop, and a small TV table. I told him I was there to check in and gave my name. He then asked if I was traveling alone, and I answered affirmatively without thinking much about it. My first mistake. When he asked for payment, I explained it would be covered by the company. There was a moment when he seemed a bit confused, but he quickly composed himself, apologized, and said he had forgotten that detail. He typed something on the computer and informed me that everything was set. With the room key and a small paper map indicating the way, I went to my room. As soon as I opened the door, the smell of cigarettes hit me. My mother smoked when I was a child, so this smell didn't bring back good memories, and I'll leave it at that. I closed and locked the door behind me, while everything inside me screamed for me to go back to the car and head home. But I valued my job too much to risk losing this opportunity. I looked at the repulsive bedspread and ended up removing it completely from the bed. I sat on the sheets and decided to call my boss to understand why they had put me in such an unpleasant place. It was late, but since we had become good friends, I thought a call at that hour wouldn't be so out of place. The phone rang several times, but she didn't answer, so I left a message and hung up. I sat in silence for a few minutes. I didn't have the courage to lie on that bed or even take off my shoes. There seemed to be a suspicious stain on the pillowcase, and I was almost certain that if I looked carefully, I would find bed bugs. After about half an hour of reflecting on what to do, I decided it would be more sensible to sleep in the car than spend more time in that room. And that's exactly what I did. I grabbed my bag and left the room as quietly as possible. I was extremely uncomfortable, but I still wanted to be polite to the people in nearby rooms and avoid waking them. As I closed the door, I felt a certain relief when I noticed that the men who had been a few doors down when I arrived were no longer there. I know it's not right to judge just by appearance, but there's nothing wrong with being cautious. I put my bag in the car and settled into the back seat, trying to get some sleep before the refresher course the next day. I don't know exactly how long I managed to sleep, but I was awakened by the sound of male voices talking not far from the car. I looked discreetly from behind the driver's seat and recognized the man who had checked me in, standing in front of the room I had just left. He was talking to the same two men I had seen when I arrived. I watched, and my stomach churned when I saw him take a key and unlock the door of the room I had abandoned. I could have tried to rationalize the situation, but at that moment, my heart was beating so fast that there was no doubt. They turned the doorknob carefully and entered the room without turning on the light. At that moment, it became clear that as soon as they realized I wasn't there, my car would be the next place they would look for me, and I would be in danger. With all the care in the world, I climbed to the front seat of the car, trying not to make the slightest noise. I turned the key in the ignition and soon heard shouts and saw the lights in the room turn on. The three men came running out, shouting something at me in a language I couldn't understand. At that instant, the car wouldn't start. It was completely dead. I tried several times, but nothing happened. The men approached my window and ordered me to get out, but getting out of the car wasn't in my plans. I grabbed my cell phone and started dialing 911. Fortunately, the operator answered quickly, and I told her almost breathlessly what was happening and where I was. She said the nearest police could arrive in about 20 minutes. Apparently, they were delayed because of the storm. She also said she would stay on the line with me, and I am eternally grateful for that. Looking back, I sincerely believe she was the reason I managed to get out of this situation alive, and without major consequences. These men, however, wouldn't give up. They tried everything to break into the car. They tried to break the windows, and even used a crowbar to force the door. After about 10 minutes without success, one of them, frustrated, climbed onto the hood and began kicking the windshield, trying to break it. It was at that moment that my fight or flight instinct kicked in, and my reaction wasn't to flee. The operator reassured me, saying I could do whatever was necessary to protect myself since my life was at risk. I even remember commenting to her that I might end up killing that man, and at that moment, the idea didn't seem exaggerated. I was prepared to fight for my life. I opened the door and got out. I think they didn't expect this reaction, but still, all three advanced towards me. Fortunately, they were all incredibly thin, and judging by the confidence with which they acted, perhaps they thought that because they were men, they could dominate me without effort. But they were terribly wrong. The first man who came at me went straight to the ground. His head hit the asphalt hard, and that was enough to ensure he wouldn't try to get up anytime soon. The second tried to knock me down, but also failed. I grabbed him by the hair and pushed him away from me with all my strength. Then the third one appeared with a knife, and I felt the cut tear across my back. The pain wasn't intense, but the shock made me release the man I was holding, and before I realized it, I was on the ground being kicked. Instinctively, I protected my head while trying to resist. That's when, through my peripheral vision, I saw the blue and red lights of the police flashing in the distance, and an enormous relief came over me. Even in the middle of the beating, with a burst of energy, I stretched out my arm and grabbed the ankle of one of the men, pulling his leg with all my strength until I saw him fall to the ground. The third one ran as soon as he spotted the police. Filled with a mixture of adrenaline and rage, I got up and began to repeatedly punch the face of the man, who was now defenseless on the ground. We were both soaked by the rain, and his blood began to mix with the water on the asphalt. At that moment, I didn't hear the police officer asking me to stop. I only felt a hand on my shoulder and turned to see his face. The man I had attacked was unconscious, and they ended up taking him in an ambulance. I was also taken to the hospital. The beating I received left some strong bruises, and the cut on my back, though nothing serious, required about 10 stitches. It wasn't pleasant, but I felt grateful to be alive. My manager called me shortly after I had arrived at the hospital, in a state of despair. She had no idea what I was talking about in the voice message. She told me she had reserved a very nice hotel in the city and didn't understand how I had ended up where I was. When she sent me the details of the correct hotel, I immediately realized what had happened. The two places had the same name, but with a slightly different spelling, and I ended up in the wrong place. The guy in the lobby had that confused expression because he genuinely had no idea what I was talking about. He just pretended so he could register me in a room to which he would have easy access. A woman traveling alone, the perfect target. That same day, after being discharged from the hospital, I returned home in a rental car and decided to take some time off work to recover. My car was towed back to the city and repaired with the company's support. Apparently, the engine had suffered serious damage, possibly caused to prevent my escape. The company I work for was very supportive after the incident. I was also relieved to learn that they arrested the other assailant, who had fled that night. Apparently, he was hiding at his mother's house. They asked me to identify him, and although it wasn't an easy task, I did it. Anything to ensure these men couldn't threaten me again. I feel this kind of situation wasn't new at that motel, but they had never been able to prove anything until my incident. Many of these men seemed to be just addicts, which would explain their thin, fragile physique. The trial was delayed due to COVID lockdowns, but they were all charged with attempted kidnapping and aggravated assault and are awaiting trial in prison. I'm eager for justice and hope all three spend a good amount of time behind bars. I know I was one of the lucky ones. Sometimes I think about what would have happened if I were a smaller woman, or if no one had come to help me. Would I still be here to tell this story? I don't know, but I'm grateful to be here and to have survived. At some point in the year 2019, an Australian police officer named Stephen Hawley was in his office reviewing a series of photographic evidence. The work was slow and mentally exhausting, as the photos that Sergeant Hawley was examining were some of the most disturbing he had ever seen. Each image showed a child under 10 years old being abused by a much older person. And it wasn't just a few photographs. Hawley continued to examine these horrible scenes when something small and seemingly insignificant caught his attention. On one of the abuser's fingers, just below the point where the skin meets the nail, there was a small dark mark. This same mark appeared on the finger of almost all the masked abusers depicted in the photos, leading Hawley to realize they were all actually the same man. It was a tiny detail, but it would become a crucial piece of physical evidence in a global police operation against child exploitation, codenamed Operation Prism. The mission aimed to dismantle the largest child exploitation site on the dark web, with about 45,000 members who accessed the site through sophisticated Tor encryption software. The Australian division of the investigation team, led by Hawley and known as Task Force Argus, discovered that the man behind the site was also Australian and likely lived in the southern part of the country. However, despite having a rough idea of his location, the man's identity remained unknown. The only clue was the four-letter username he used to communicate on the site: Surf. A few weeks later, the Assistant Commissioner of Police of South Australia, Paul Dixon, received a call from a Task Force Argus officer. All they said was, "We have a potential target in our jurisdiction," Dixon recounted. But at that point, we didn't know his name, who he was. We didn't even know he existed. The only thing we had was the username, Surf. The global investigation into the site, whose name was kept in absolute secrecy, went public in 2016 when a German man was arrested on child exploitation charges. This was how the police first discovered that the person responsible for the site operated from South Australia. With the focus turned to that region, the police managed to arrest a high-ranking member of the site who resided in Queensland. The expectation was that he would be the enigmatic Surf, but to the investigators' disappointment, he wasn't. However, the man confirmed that Surf was indeed Australian and operated from the southern part of the country. Another breakthrough in the case occurred in early 2019 when Dutch police raided the apartment of a child abuse suspect and seized his electronic devices. When analyzing the man's hard drive, investigators discovered he had direct access to the infamous site and demanded he provide his credentials. Using the suspect's login data, the police managed to access the site and began analyzing the metadata of various photographs. Almost all the images had been captured with the same camera model, a compact Panasonic. Wherever Surf was getting his illegal content, more than 90% seemed to come from the same source. The officers of Task Force Argus began exploring the internet in search of other mentions of the username Surf. After weeks of work, they found a lead on a forum dedicated to conversations between owners of four-wheel drive vehicles. There, they discovered that several comments had been written by a user called Surf. He identified himself as an experienced off-road driver and seemed to have strong opinions about the best types of tires and suspensions to adapt a vehicle to any terrain. But what caught the officer's attention almost immediately was the writing style, which seemed incredibly similar to Surf's on the infamous site. They just needed one piece of evidence to confirm it. 2 days later, after scouring thousands of Surf's posts and comments, the police made a decisive discovery. Many of the links Surf shared were broken, but one still worked. And it was exactly what they needed. Following the link, the officers came across a Volkswagen Amarok, a dual-cab pickup produced by VW since 2010. But most relevant was that the vehicle's license plate was visible. When they entered it into the national database, a name appeared: Shannon McCool. A preliminary background check revealed something truly disturbing. Shannon McCool one of the world's largest distributors of child exploitation material, had been working with children and young people in various volunteer programs for almost 10 years. Worse yet, at the time of the investigation, Shannon was a full-time employee at the Department of Child Protection of South Australia. This meant he had direct access to several highly vulnerable children. The Task Force Argus officers took action, gathering as much data and evidence about McCool as they could to secure a conviction. They needed to build a solid case, but this meant having to wait and allowing McCool to continue operating the site, causing irreparable harm to an unknown number of innocent children. As the investigation progressed, the police made another disturbing discovery. In the summer of 2018, an anonymous informant contacted the Department of Child Protection, McCool's employer, alleging that he had made an inappropriate comment about one of the children under his care. Shannon was suspended for 3 months while an official investigation was conducted. But amazingly, he was authorized to return to work after vehemently denying the accusations, and in the face of a lack of concrete evidence. The officers involved in the investigation were understandably disturbed by these new details. It was clear that McCool was a real and imminent threat to the safety of children everywhere. However, it was also through the careful analysis of McCool and his images that they made their biggest breakthrough yet. One of the Task Force Argus officers was given a rather unusual task: to identify photos on McCool's social media that showed his hands in any kind of detail. Since the abusers in the photographic evidence took all care to hide their faces, what really differentiated them were their hands, or more precisely, their fingers. So the officer spent hours cropping images of McCool's hands, as well as the fingers of other suspects of trafficking or child exploitation. These images were then meticulously enhanced digitally, preparing them to be used as possible identifiers of the abusers in the photographs. Then one day, Sergeant Stephen Hawley went to the station where the officer was working to see the progress. The officer was in the process of enhancing images of McCool's hands, and upon examining them, Hawley was speechless. On Shannon's middle finger, just below the line where the skin meets the nail, there was a small dark freckle. It was him, the man from the photographs. Shannon was not just one of the world's largest distributors of child exploitation material. He was also directly involved in creating this material, while maintaining direct access to some of Australia's most vulnerable children. As mentioned, the initial decision was not to arrest Shannon immediately. The police wanted to gather evidence about him discreetly, avoiding alerting him about the investigation, as this could give him the chance to warn others involved or destroy crucial evidence. However, after discovering that, in addition to being an employee of the South Australia Department of Child Protection, Shannon was personally involved in exploiting children, the police realized they couldn't wait any longer and needed to arrest him as soon as possible. But for the arrest to occur without Shannon having the chance to destroy evidence, a delicate and decisive operation needed to be planned. There are certain programs and techniques that someone can use to make their devices completely inaccessible to us, explained one of the officers. No matter who you are, you couldn't access anything. And if that had happened in this case, we wouldn't have obtained the same type of result we did. Our timing and our discretion were absolutely essential to the success of this operation. On the night of June 10, 2019, Shannon McCool was at home, possibly supervising his sinister empire, when he heard a soft knock on the front door. He got up from his chair, leaving his laptop open, and went to the door to see who it might be. From the sound, it could have been a neighbor, a salesperson, perhaps even a friend or relative. However, when he opened the door and found no one, he took a step outside to check. The moment his foot touched the concrete, Sergeant Hawley ambushed him, pressing him against the wall before forcing him to sit down. McCool was informed of his arrest and his right to remain silent, but he remained quiet. Hawley later commented that McCool seemed in shock, almost as if he hadn't imagined something like this could happen. However, as he understood the reason for the police's presence, his face turned pale, and he sat staring into space as if he had entered a catatonic state. It was the end. His life was about to change forever. Minutes after McCool's capture, officers from various Australian police agencies were already surrounding his apartment. Sergeant Hawley was the first to enter the living room. There, on a small brown coffee table, was McCool's Toshiba laptop, still connected to an external hard drive that probably contained a vast collection of repulsive material. Hawley noticed that McCool was using sophisticated encryption software, but the cybercrime specialists were able to circumvent it with ease. And once that was done, it only took a few clicks for the officers to have complete access to one of the largest collections of child exploitation material ever discovered. The police also recovered the same Panasonic digital camera that McCool used to produce most of his collection, which would make the judicial process against him even more solid. Task Force Argus took almost 2 weeks to identify just 7 victims among the thousands of obscene photographs. It was a slow and meticulous process, and much of the work involved contacting the children's charities with which McCool had collaborated. Most of these institutions kept detailed records of the children who went through their programs. And after receiving hundreds of files, Sergeant Hawley and Task Force Argus began to physically compare the children with those seen in McCool's material. 7 of them were physically identical to the children registered in the Department of Child Protection's files. I was relieved that we identified 7 victims, Sergeant Hawley commented later. We examined everything, cross-referencing dates and periods when the children were under his care. Everything matched. The saddest thing is that we don't know if these were all of them. There could be more victims, and we could never be absolutely certain. Another piece of evidence that Task Force Argus was able to use was the exact correspondence between McCool's handwriting and certain writings present in the photos. It's a common practice among those who produce this type of indecent material to create so-called proof photos. The creators use various techniques, and one of them involves a handwritten message from the abuser indicating the date, time, or even their username. This was the technique adopted by McCool, and it provided evidence that Task Force Argus was satisfied to add to the growing body of proof. I believe I identified 14 photos where he had written something by hand on a post-it or piece of paper, explained Sergeant Hawley. He would actually place these notes on the child just before or during the abuse. With samples of his handwriting collected from his home, we were able to compare it with that in the images, and again, the match was perfect. Realizing the amount of evidence against him, McCool offered full cooperation with the ongoing investigation. Hawley accepted the offer, but his priority wasn't a confession. They already had enough evidence to secure a life sentence. What McCool could really offer were the identities of the other children he had documented abusing. He agreed to be interviewed by Sergeant Hawley, with other officers observing in the adjacent room. Thus began a long session of questions and answers. The priority was to identify the other children, said Hawley. At that point, I was confident we would get the necessary result. He provided 4 names and then claimed he couldn't remember the others, who numbered in the dozens. McCool also answered the question about the dark website he maintained and operated. And although he tried to minimize his direct participation in the abuse, some of his answers left even the most experienced officers deeply shaken. When asked about his day-to-day involvement with the site, McCool shocked everyone by describing the pride he felt in his horrendous collection. It was surreal, reported a witness. After the first interview, we simply sat in the parking lot for a while, unable to speak. I think we were impressed by the magnitude of what McCool had confessed. After 2 more one-hour interviews, Hawley began to perceive how manipulative and cunningly calculating McCool was. His methods were, at the very least, cunning, he explained. I believe this is one of the reasons why his victims were so young. As soon as he suspected a child might tell someone, he would distance himself from them. He was extremely selective in who he chose as a victim. Sergeant Hawley had no doubt that McCool would have continued to abuse children if he hadn't been arrested. He was waiting for his next opportunity. That's my honest belief. It could have taken 6 months, it could have taken 2 years, but if given the chance, he would offend again. After his sentencing hearing on August 7, 2020, McCool was sentenced to 35 years in prison with a minimum period of 28 years without the possibility of parole. However, in April 2023, his sentence was supposedly reduced by 2 to 3 years after he helped in the identification and capture of a notorious Danish criminal. Upon learning of the sentence reduction, the father of one of McCool's victims gave a statement to an ABC News Australia journalist. I don't like to know that he's getting a new sentence because he has no remorse at all, the father said. He didn't even say thank you. He sat there with a smug smile the whole time. I suggest to McCool and anyone else who has ever hurt a child that they stop thinking about themselves and start thinking about the children. These children are living a life of pain while their abusers get 3 meals a day and a roof over their heads. Prisoners who help the police capture other criminals typically receive considerable reductions in their sentences. The judge could have given Shannon McCool a bigger discount, but he opted to reduce only 2 to 3 years. Your cooperation wasn't complete, especially regarding a serious matter in this jurisdiction, the judge stated. This doesn't reduce your discount, but it shows that there are issues you still keep secret. Your regret and remorse are, at best, ambiguous and uncertain. Perhaps in this case, the judge was right about something. Since then, Shannon McCool has claimed to be sorry for his actions and expressed a desire to continue collaborating with authorities. But it's likely that his motivations are little more than self-preservation. Perhaps the best clue to how Shannon really feels about his crimes is in a 5-word comment he left on his site's message board. Abusing children should be acceptable. I remember clearly that cold October night. The day had been exhausting, and I was drained after driving hours for a work appointment. To give you an idea, I was a man slightly below average in height, and I've always considered myself a bit pessimistic. I decided to stop at a modest hotel right beside the highway, one of those places where travelers can rest without having to drive to a big city just to catch some sleep. The hotel seemed to have seen better days. Outside, the sign with the word vacancy illuminated the emptiness of the place, and it wasn't hard to understand why. The parking lot was practically deserted, except for a few rusty cars. I parked and went to the lobby. Inside, I was greeted by an attendant who barely took his eyes off his phone, clearly uninterested in offering any hospitality. I paid for the room, and he handed me a key, exchanging few words with me. The entire interaction was somewhat awkward. On my way to the room, I couldn't ignore the feeling that something was wrong with that place, but the exhaustion was so overwhelming that I brushed it off. The room was as neglected as the rest of the hotel. The curtains had tears and stains, and the air was impregnated with a musty smell. I decided to take a quick shower and fall into bed, determined to sleep for a few hours and leave before dawn. I think I barely slept an hour when I was awakened by a loud argument in the next room. Someone was fighting about something I couldn't understand. I got up and pressed my ear against the thin wall that separated us, managing to catch some muffled words. "Where's my money, Evan?" The voice was harsh and demanding, while another person, presumably Evan, responded with a terrified tone. The conversation seemed to be getting out of control, and it soon became clear that someone would end up getting hurt. I knew I needed to act, but fear almost prevented me from doing anything. I thought about calling the police, but besides having little concrete information to pass on, I also knew that intervention could worsen the situation. Just when I was evaluating the possibilities, the argument turned physical. Loud sounds echoed through the walls, followed by what I could only imagine were punches. The walls were practically paper thin, and I could hear everything. Evan apparently didn't stand a chance. I left my room and cautiously went to the door, peering through the peephole of the room next door. The hotel was old and hadn't bothered to replace those peepholes with the ones that only allow you to see from inside to outside. What I saw sent a shiver down my spine. 2 men were holding Evan, both much larger and more threatening than him. He was injured with blood flowing from his nose and mouth, his eyes swollen with tears, and his face marked by desperation, pleading for his life. The aggressors had their backs to the door, and at that moment I realized I had no other choice. Someone needed to be warned. It wasn't the time to let personal opinions prevent me from trying to save a life. I ran back to my room, grabbed my cell phone, and dialed the emergency number. I whispered to the operator about the situation and described my location as best I could, since I wasn't familiar with the area. My heart was pounding as I returned to the peephole, trying to maintain control over the nightmare unfolding next door. At that moment, I saw one of the men take a gun from his waistband. Panic overwhelmed me, and I crouched on the floor. I was consumed by fear, and couldn't risk them noticing me or hearing any movement through the door. The sound of gunshots cut through the silence, followed by Evan's screams of agony. Tears began to flow as the feeling of helplessness crushed me. The minutes dragged on as I remained on the floor, trapped in the terror of the moment. The sound of Evan's suffering was one of the most horrible things I've ever heard. He moaned and screamed in pain while the aggressors mocked him, calling him weak for expressing how much he was suffering. That cruelty nauseated me. Police and paramedics finally arrived. The officers knocked on the door next door, ordering whoever was inside to surrender. I think they hadn't yet realized that the aggressors had already fled. The only response they heard was Evan's cry for help, begging for assistance. Soon after, I saw the police breaking down the door and calling for the paramedics. The anxiety and fear were palpable as I waited for the agents to take control and finally offer the help Evan needed. Eventually, one of the officers knocked on my door, identifying himself. I opened and anxiously told everything I had heard and seen. They explained that I would need to go to the station to give a formal statement. I found that somewhat strange, but I knew it was necessary. I gathered my things from the room and headed to the station. While I was sitting there that night, giving my statement to the detective for what seemed like the 100th time, I couldn't get Evan out of my head. I never met him, never exchanged a word, but somehow I felt connected to him in those few, intense moments. In my eyes, no one deserves such a brutal end, just because they probably had a debt to someone. I wish I could have done more, but being so small and with no experience in self-defense, if I had tried to interfere, I probably would have been seriously injured or worse. And as much as people say they would risk everything, I simply couldn't put my life in danger for someone I didn't even know. Later that same night, I was informed that Evan had died shortly after arriving at the hospital. The injuries caused by the gunshots were too severe. There wasn't much they could do. The detective tried to reassure me, saying I did the right thing by calling the police, and that my testimony could be essential to bringing the culprits to justice if they were ever found. Unfortunately, as I write this, almost 9 years have passed without any news about the case. It saddens me that Evan's family still hasn't obtained justice for what happened to him. That night left me completely traumatized, but it also reminds me how fortunate I am to still have my life. That's something Evan will never have, and the only thing that separated us that night was a wall. Our choices led us to the same place at the same time, but somehow we remained in different worlds. I was staying at a hotel with my mother. I must have been around 16 years old. We had gone to the city for a concert, and I was excited to swim in the indoor pool. My mother, however, was determined not to go with me. I tried to convince her, saying I could go alone, but she hesitated, worried about the possibility of something bad happening, like kidnapping. At the time, I thought she was being exaggerated and overprotective. Determined, I put on my swimsuit and said I was going anyway, whether she liked it or not. She yelled, calling me a brat, and I left, slamming the door. I went down the stairs and across the corridor to the pool. Fortunately, I took the room key card with me, as it was necessary to enter. When I entered, I was a bit disappointed to see the place was packed. about 10 children in the pool, and several adults in the hot tub. Going back to the room wasn't an option. I knew my mother would have some comment to make, and I wasn't willing to listen. I chose a nearby chair to leave my things, and went straight to the deep end, where I could get away from the younger children. The water was heated, which was a pleasant surprise. It wasn't cold, as is usually the case in other pools. I enjoyed about 10 minutes of tranquility until I noticed a man approaching. He appeared to be in his 60s, and I immediately felt uncomfortable. He hadn't done anything yet, nor had he even looked directly at me, but something about him gave me a strange feeling. That intuition that sometimes alerts us to bad intentions, even without evidence. He entered the pool and swam towards the deeper part, stopping very close to me. He was just over a meter away and started making conversation, asking about school and my personal preferences. I tried to ignore him, but he kept insisting that I talk. I politely said I didn't speak to strangers, but he did that thing that some creepy people do. He introduced himself, saying that now we weren't strangers anymore, almost like the character Pennywise, and let out a laugh. That bothered me deeply, and I asked him to leave me alone. I got out of the pool and went to the hot tub, thinking that maybe near some adults I would feel safer. To my surprise and discomfort, the man got out of the pool and entered the hot tub as well, sitting right next to me. He let out a groan and commented on how great the water was, but it was clear it was just an excuse for the noise, as he made it just when his leg touched mine. I moved to the other side of the tub, and he made a sad expression, as if offended. I sat far away, avoiding looking in his direction and trying to enjoy the hot water. But soon, he ruined the moment with another weird behavior. I felt someone's foot touching mine, not in an accidental way, but as if it were a caress. With the jets and bubbles, I couldn't see clearly, but it was obvious who was doing it. I looked at the man, who had a slight smile on his face, and then he mumbled something. When he repeated it, I clearly heard, "Do you like that?" I stood up in the water at that instant, yelling at him and calling him a pervert. He seemed offended, and I told the other adults in the tub what he had just said to me, and how he was trying to play footsie with me. Fortunately, some of the men intervened and removed him from there. I thanked them, and they assured me I would be safe there. The wives approached to comfort me and asked if I would like to be accompanied to my room, but stubborn, I refused. I didn't want to give my mother the satisfaction of being right, so I decided to stay. I stayed there for another hour before the group of people who were with me had to leave. There were still other families around, which made me feel safe. With my eyes closed and leaning against the hot tub wall, I suddenly felt the water move, indicating that someone had just entered. When I opened my eyes, my heart nearly jumped out of my chest to see that same man from before. He sat across from me and gave me that same horrible, disturbing smile, but this time he whispered a threat. He said my room number, and with a dark tone, warned that if I screamed or made any sound, he would go there and do something terrible to my mother. I was terrified. I wanted to scream and cry, but at just 16, I didn't realize I had more control over the situation than I imagined. I remained motionless, watching in a state of shock as he approached and sat beside me. He got so close that his leg pressed against mine. When he put his hand on my thigh, tears began to roll down my face, and it was at that moment that clarity emerged. I didn't have to endure this. I wasn't obligated to stay there, allowing him to harass me that way. In a burst, I got up as fast as I could, leaving the hot tub as if my life depended on it. And deep down, I think it did. While he was still sitting, I pulled my leg back and kicked with all my strength at the back of his head. The other families around started screaming. One of the women ran to me, asking what had happened. I explained quickly, and she, filled with indignation, began yelling at the man, who was now almost unconscious, holding his head and clearly furious. When he tried to come at us, the woman bent down, grabbed his hair, and pulled. At that moment, another woman who appeared out of nowhere kicked him right in the face, and believe it or not, knocked the guy out. It turns out that, without my knowledge, she had been listening to everything. She and the other women were about to enter the tub to do who knows what to him when I decided to run. I darted down the corridor, up the stairs, and desperately knocked on the hotel room door. My mother opened it, and I, sobbing, was pulled inside while she frantically asked what had happened. Between sobs and tears, I could barely explain, but when I managed to, I saw fury take over her. She told me to stay in the room and left, promising she would be back soon. The next thing I remember is her returning with bloodstains on her clothes, and saying that man would never bother a girl again. I asked what had happened, but she didn't want to give details. Later, the police knocked on our door to question us, but my mother had already changed clothes, and they didn't mention anything about her involvement. We discovered that the man was found unconscious, floating in the hot tub, surrounded by his own blood. To our disappointment, he survived. He was arrested and taken to the hospital, and we never received more information about his condition. We were satisfied with that. We didn't want to know, and to be honest, we didn't care. He was charged with assault on a minor, and it wasn't the first time he had done something like this, which led to a longer sentence. We were relieved that justice was finally served, not just for me, but also for other girls he probably hurt in the past, and perhaps even for those who never had the chance to report. I ended up needing therapy to deal with all of this. My mother carries immense guilt for letting me go to the pool alone that day. I've tried to convince her it's not her fault, but there's nothing I can say to ease that feeling. It's painful to know that people like that exist in the world, and even more distressing to know that many of them are never punished. Since I was little, all I ever wanted was to help people. My mom used to say that even as a child, I would play nurse with my dolls. As I grew up and entered adolescence, I fell in love with shows like Grey's Anatomy and spent hours binge-watching Scrubs on those famous DVD box sets from back in the day. During my last years of high school, while some friends were still unsure about university courses, I had a firm answer when asked what I wanted to do. Nursing. That was all I wanted to do. After getting a good score on the exam, I met all the prerequisites, selected a few schools and programs, and started sending in my applications. After being accepted, I realized I would need to support myself financially, as the financial aid I had access to was limited. So I got a part-time job, and after a few weeks of searching on Craigslist and other sites, I found an almost ideal position. I prefer not to mention the name of the place where I worked, but it was something like a community center for young adults with learning difficulties. We didn't offer emergency or intensive care for people with physical disabilities, and more complex cases were referred to comprehensive care centers. However, for those who couldn't work, but also couldn't stay at home all day, our space offered a welcoming and educational environment where they could spend time and develop. Honestly, it was the kind of place I would have been happy to volunteer at even if I wasn't being paid. The flexibility of the part-time schedule made it perfect for me in many ways. Besides being a positive point on my resume, it made sense that they would hire someone with a desire to work in nursing, as I would certainly bring the same care and dedication to the community center. Fortunately, the center's management team had the same vision, and when I received the job offer call, I was simply radiant. In the first few days, I dedicated my time to getting to know the center's space and the various members who frequented the place. Some were there every day from early morning until late afternoon, while others appeared only occasionally on days when their parents needed someone to keep an eye on them. Some spent their time playing pool or watching TV, but there were those who needed more engaging activities to stay happy and occupied. One of the things that surprised me at first was seeing a guy named Teddy helping sweep the parking lot with one of the care team members. For a moment, I was concerned, thinking he might be forced to do the work without being paid. But I soon understood that Teddy really enjoyed helping. For him, it meant feeling useful, like he was part of the team. Seeing our happiness and hearing compliments like, "Great job, buddy," made a big difference to him. Once I understood that, I found his attitude the sweetest thing, and any concerns I had about members helping at the center disappeared. Another member who helped with the daily operation of the center was a guy I'll call Jasper. He was undoubtedly one of the most functional among those who frequented the place, appearing perhaps 2 or 3 times a week, including weekends. He was close to 30, a bit older than the other visitors, who were usually in the high school or college phase. In previous years, Jasper used to frequent the center more regularly, but at that time, he preferred to show up after lunch, helping with any task he could, and often staying until closing before walking or sometimes running home. I was surprised when I learned that he walked or ran about 3 miles to and from the center every time. He himself said it was great exercise, and that's the interesting thing about Jasper. It was almost imperceptible that he had any learning difficulties. The conversation flowed normally until, out of nowhere, he would throw out an out-of-context question, and you would remember how he had become so familiar with the center. For example, one day we were unloading some egg cartons from a van and casually chatting when he suddenly asked, "Do all eggs come from chickens?" When I replied, "Yes, of course," he countered, "And how do you know that?" I had to explain that I wasn't absolutely certain that all eggs were from chickens, but that the store operated on a trust system, and I could ask for a refund if any weren't from chickens. Jasper seemed thoughtful for a moment, then just nodded and went back to unloading the boxes. I had the feeling that Jasper still hadn't fully understood, but small misunderstandings like this were things he had already learned to deal with. And the truth is, everyone loved Jasper. He was loved because he was helpful, because he was attentive, and above all, Because he was one of the few members who could really express how grateful he was for the center and the team. Most members, in a very sweet way, would limit themselves to saying an or an I love you, which was already incredible, and I valued every kind word I received. But Jasper went beyond that. He could truly communicate what he felt for us. One day, I saw a colleague take refuge in the break room in tears after he said something like, "I don't know what I would do without this place. Sometimes you are like a family to me." She wasn't the type to get emotional easily, but it seems Jasper's words touched something deep within her, and she didn't want him to interpret her tears of happiness as sadness. Besides all that, Jasper was also popular for other reasons. He often brought things from home. Sometimes he would show up with a tray of fresh cookies. Other times it was a bag of sandwiches, or even a brand new PlayStation for the game room. When the winter cold hit hard, he would arrive with a portable heater. From what I knew, Jasper didn't work, so I imagined he had some independent source of income or generous parents who didn't mind investing in new gaming systems and other things for the center. I know that everyone would continue to like Jasper even if he weren't so generous. But naturally, these kindnesses endeared him to many. Life would be much more difficult without them. But perhaps because of all this, I was even more divided when, after hearing so many amazing stories about him, I had a very negative experience with Jasper. You see, one night, while we were closing the center, I was finishing counting our food inventory, something that had been interrupted earlier that day. I knew Jasper was around, so I wasn't surprised when he appeared in the pantry at the back of the kitchen. But the question he asked me was unexpected. "Do you have a boyfriend?" At that moment, I didn't have a boyfriend, but I was so disconcerted that I ended up telling Jasper that yes, I did. It was a somewhat instinctive response, because I didn't want to give margin for other ideas by answering that I didn't. Jasper then asked what it was like to have a boyfriend. I replied that it was good and that I liked him very much. That's when Jasper commented that he would like to have a girlfriend, that he had never had one, and that he wanted to feel that same kind of cool, as he described it. It seemed like one of those moments with Jasper where he said something so sweet that it touched your heart. However, suddenly the conversation changed to something totally unexpected and disturbing. After saying about this kind of cool, he paused, looked at me again, and asked something that almost made me lose my breath. He wanted to know if my boyfriend and I practiced a certain act that was, let's say, extremely out of bounds. To be clear, I'm not the type of person who gets offended easily. But what he asked was so extreme that if a partner asked me for that on a date, I would probably end the night right there. I tried to stay calm and reminded myself who was really asking the question. Although Jasper had a somewhat uncomfortable smile on his face, I responded in a professional tone. I explained that his question was not appropriate for a casual conversation, and that it could be considered rude. I also said that the type of thing he mentioned was not exactly what normal or romantic couples would do. Jasper apologized in the way he always did when he made some mistake, but this time there was something different. He said he was sorry, but his expression suggested otherwise. All of this left a bitter taste. So the next day, I mentioned the incident to my boss. She said she would have acted exactly as I did, and that I did well to report it as soon as I could. It wasn't the first time a visitor, mostly men, had made an inappropriate comment to the staff, mostly women. But until then, education had always been the best response, not shame or exclusion. I completely agreed that most of these transgressions were nothing more than innocent mistakes. But as I mentioned, Jasper's expression left me uncomfortable and gave me the impression that he wasn't really sorry. I chose not to share this, not because it wasn't relevant, but because I thought it wouldn't add anything. I knew that if Jasper crossed the line again, I could escalate my complaint with the support of my boss. With that in mind, I decided not to talk more about the subject. I didn't want to influence others' opinions about Jasper, and since it seemed like he had learned his lesson and was avoiding inappropriate questions, I decided to let the matter drop instead of spreading the story. Things remained calm for a while, with Jasper being his usual cheerful self, until the day when everything changed suddenly and definitively. One night, another team member and I were closing the center, while Jasper helped with some tasks. I was in the file room, a small closet without windows, packed with folders on old, dusty shelves, when suddenly, who walks in but Jasper himself? This happened a few years before all records were transferred to the digital system. Since everything in that room was considered sensitive, we kept the door locked at all times. To enter, I had to get my keys and unlock the door, but I made the mistake of leaving them in the lock. When Jasper entered the room, I noticed he had taken my keys. I asked him to return them, but he just ignored me, with that disturbingly familiar smile on his face. When I asked for the second time, he turned, put the key in the lock, and locked the door with a loud click. They say that in really scary moments, you feel your blood freeze or your veins turn to ice. I had never understood what that meant until that instant. But indeed, my entire body shuddered. Seeing Jasper lock that door was terrifying, not just because we were trapped inside, but because he knew exactly what he was doing. I asked for the third time to give me back the keys, and he tossed them high up on top of a file box on an upper shelf before taking a few steps in my direction. I kept saying, "This isn't funny, Jasper. Give me the keys and get out," but he ignored my words. He simply continued following me around the file room, while I tried unsuccessfully to maintain distance. He was much larger and faster than me. At one point, I tried to reach for the keys, and that was enough for him to lunge at me. I prefer not to go into detail about what he tried to do, but it was exactly what every woman fears will never happen. But I didn't let him take it that far. I fought, and fortunately, he stopped. However, instead of unlocking the door and leaving, Jasper began to punch, kick, and stomp on me as I fell to the ground. I tried to move away, but that only made it easier for him to hit me in the head, ribs, and other vulnerable spots. And then suddenly he stopped. I heard the keys jingling, heard the lock turn, and as I turned, I saw that Jasper had gone, leaving the door open. What happened next seems like a distant dream, as if it had happened to someone else. I think the adrenaline, the punches and kicks to the head, and the complete surprise of the attack put me in a state of dissociation. When I remember, it's as if another person had gotten up and, limping, walked to the phone at reception to call 911. Instead of feeling hysterical, I felt strangely calm, and today I understand that it was a mechanism to delay the trauma, a response of act now, process later. I was still on the phone with 911 when my coworker entered reception and saw me. I knew I was hurt, but I couldn't see myself, you know. When my colleague looked at me and was visibly horrified to see the blood and my torn clothes, it was the first time I realized the real severity of the situation. In the end, I didn't need the ambulance because my colleague took me straight to the hospital. She was like a guardian angel, staying by my side during the exams, and then giving me a ride back to the dorm after we talked to 2 police officers who showed up at the hospital. On the way back to the dorm, I was an emotional wreck and spent about 5 or 10 minutes crying on her shoulder after we parked. The nurses had cleaned me up well, but I was still swollen and knew I would have a black eye or 2. Fortunately, nothing was broken, although it was, up to that point, the worst experience of my life. I felt the support of everyone, and the police promised to investigate the case. When I look back, I notice a small sign that things might not end as I expected. It was when my colleague asked me what had happened. The first time was on the way to the hospital, and when I told her it had been Jasper, she was shocked, but not to the point of doubting me. I myself would never have imagined that among all the men who frequented the center, Jasper would be capable of something like this. But the fact was, he had done it. But when I was sitting in her car in the dorm parking lot, and my colleague asked again what had happened in the file room, I noticed she was beginning to doubt my version of events. It's not that she thought I was lying, but it was as if she simply couldn't imagine Jasper being capable of something so terrible. I should have predicted that she wouldn't be the only one to react that way. At that time, I understood perfectly why she would be so stunned to the point of hesitating to believe. It was a hard story to assimilate, but like many unbelievable stories, every word was true. I had no idea that this doubt would spread, grow, and end up dividing an entire community to the point of forcing me to leave a job I had learned to love. The first sign was when I received a call from my boss informing me that I was suspended without pay until the police investigation was completed. Jasper apparently denied everything, claiming complete ignorance and even saying he wasn't at the center on the day I was attacked. Fortunately, we had security cameras at the center that could easily refute that claim. However, Jasper's parents firmly believed his version, justifying that he had arrived home at his usual time. This may not seem like such a relevant detail, but it left me very frightened, both then and now, and I think it's worth mentioning. Jasper stayed at the center well beyond normal hours that day, perhaps 25 to 30 minutes after closing, when he would normally have already started his walk or run home. This meant that to arrive home at his usual time, he would have had to run 3 miles in a heavy jacket and probably wearing Crocs at an almost impossible pace. He wasn't smart enough to hide things properly, but he still tried, which only confirms that he knew what he had done was horrible. Later, I learned that he ended up admitting the attack, but claimed it was a panic reaction because I had allegedly tried to touch him. Jasper claimed he got scared, reacted, and then blacked out until he found himself at home in a panic. But I knew this wasn't true, as one of the officers told me that this version contradicted his parents' initial statement, which said he arrived home at his usual time and didn't appear to be disturbed. Basically, all the evidence confirmed my version and forced Jasper to admit what he did. But people accepted his story that he had lost control after a provocation. Don't get me wrong, most people were sympathetic to me and acknowledged that Jasper's behavior was wrong and needed attention. But at the same time, these same people refused to believe he was truly dangerous and guilty. The situation took another turn when a work colleague came to me and tried to convince me to drop the charges. She explained that if I proceeded, Jasper could be removed from his parents' custody and placed in a psychiatric institution for an indefinite period. If he were diagnosed with a serious problem and didn't respond to treatment, he could be trapped in the system for years. On the other hand, if I dropped the charges, his parents could seek private help without needing to separate from him for a long period. She implied that many other people also thought the right thing to do would be to withdraw the complaint. When I told her I wouldn't do that, she called me selfish. I'd like to say I dealt with the situation calmly, but that's not what happened. I was furious, a fury I had never felt before, and had to walk away to avoid losing control. I couldn't believe what I had just heard. That word selfish left me with boiling blood in a way I can hardly express. Looking back, I understand she didn't use the word selfish in the sense of accusing me of thinking only of myself instead of considering Jasper and his condition. What she meant was that by proceeding with the process, I would end up cutting Jasper's connection with the community center, which would also mean the end of the gifts, and as I later discovered, the loss of the generous tax-deductible donations made by Jasper's very rich parents. In the end, Jasper was deemed unable to stand trial. Since he admitted the attack, he was referred to a psychiatric hospital on the other side of the state. The only caveat, according to the same officer I spoke with, is that Jasper would probably leave the mental health system long before I would feel safe with it. My case was the first failure in an otherwise impeccable history, and with that in mind, judges would certainly look very sympathetically on him and his so charitable parents. With the investigation closed, my suspension was lifted, and I was invited to return to work at the community center. I declined the offer. I couldn't go back to a place that, in the end, seemed to value a family's money more than my safety and that of the other women who worked there. This might seem like a spoiled attitude on my part, especially because not everyone was on Jasper's side. My boss, in particular, was incredibly supportive, but the idea of going back was unbearable to me. And again, this doesn't mean they thought Jasper hadn't lost control. They just didn't believe he was capable of something like that again, while myself and the authorities saw the situation differently. Writing all this makes me realize how long and complicated the situation seems now. And I know some people might hear this story and once again sympathize with my attacker. But I don't care. Getting all this out has brought me a certain relief, and writing has been a reminder that I did the right thing. I walked away from the community center, and since then have immersed myself in my studies. I applied for nursing positions in practically all cities and states, except the one where all this happened. I believe other people might have followed Jasper's treatment just to monitor the date of his release. But over time, I decided I don't want to know. I just want to move on with my life and leave this in the past. I don't want to think about these moments anymore, although I know that complete distance may never be possible. Sometimes I feel like a pair of tectonic plates. I don't know exactly how to describe it. It's as if, from time to time, the accumulated tension needs to be released. But other than that, I can go years without more than a fleeting thought on the matter. I guess that's why I decided to write this post and share my experience, hoping that somehow it helps me release this burden. In the end, I think only time will tell. So this happened in May of 2021. My husband Jacob and I own a 5-story building that's over 100 years old. We have our business there, an antique marketplace, our apartment on the top floor, and a few tenants. In the previous years, we had suffered a series of break-ins, so we reinforced the security of the main doors with robust steel bars, more cameras, the whole package. It was around 3 in the morning, and we were in our apartment, sleeping deeply as usual, when we received a call from Sentry Tech, our security company. They had detected movement in an unusual area, not on the main floor, where we keep 90% of the jewelry, but on the lower floor. Usually, this type of alert is caused by a spider on the camera, a mouse, or unexpected shadows. I was wearing just a tank top and shorts, and my hair was messy, but Jacob was at least wearing sweatpants. After we verified each area, I checked the front door, which was intact, while Jacob went to check the back. He suddenly called me, saying, "There's someone in there." I started fumbling with my phone, desperately trying to dial 911. In these moments, it seems like your brain freezes, like in that scene with the black monolith in 2001, A Space Odyssey. After a few eternal seconds, I managed to call and ran to the back, narrating to the 911 operator. "Broken glass, destroyed window," I said, as I later heard in court. "Oh my God, there's someone in here. Please come quickly." Right after that, a deafening crash filled the air. It was as if everything was being shattered in there. The feeling of hearing your livelihood being destroyed is indescribable. Who was in there? How many were there? What trail of destruction were they leaving? I could only scream into the phone, a desperate voice begging for help that I knew was still minutes away from arriving. Remember, I had just woken up in the middle of this nightmare, almost naked, and every second seemed to make things worse. In the end, the thief, Kevin, ended up face to face with Jacob as he tried to escape through the broken window before the police arrived. They stared at each other for a moment, and Kevin said something before running back inside the building. He dropped the backpack with the stolen items, climbed over an iron gate, broke through our tenant's restaurant door, and left through their main entrance. At this point, he was covered in cuts from the glass, bleeding quite a bit. Jacob intercepted him at the exit, and without hesitation, launched himself at him, throwing him hard against the cement and immobilizing him on the ground. Adrenaline is truly a fierce thing. On the other end of the line with the 911 operator, I wasn't crying, but I was pleading urgently for help to arrive soon. I was terrified by the intense fear of seeing my husband die right in front of me. Then, driven by adrenaline, I ran straight to the scene without thinking, guided by this almost irrational impulse. There we were, in the middle of the street, illuminated by the weak orange light of the street lamps, trying to understand what was happening. Thank God Kevin wasn't armed, and he clearly wasn't expecting someone to attack him like that in the dark. He had carried out hundreds of burglaries without ever being caught, And now, he was completely immobilized by Jacob, who had the situation under control. Kevin, realizing he had no way out, decided to pretend to be unconscious. Suddenly, we heard the sound of an engine accelerating and tires screeching. Without realizing it, I started screaming. It was Kevin's getaway driver, his wife, Lisa. She leaned out the window and shouted, "Get off him, or I'll kill you." Although she was clearly talking to me, as captured in the audio, I barely remember this. Without waiting, she tried to run me over. I vaguely remember realizing the situation was completely out of control. But in an absurd impulse, I focused on trying to read the license plate over the phone. It was from another state, and I was struggling to decipher it while everything around me seemed like a blur. That was all my brain managed to retain. How close she came to turning me into a stain on the asphalt, perhaps a foot away, as I dodged like a clumsy bullfighter, holding my phone like it was a cape. A year later, we had to listen to the 911 recording at the prosecutor's office, synchronized with a video. This video was from a nearby store, equipped with high-quality external cameras. Jacob started crying. He had no idea how close it had all been. The sound of the engine drowned out my screams, and at one point, my voice was completely worn out. I tried to repeat the license plate number like a mantra, but no one could hear me because of the roar of the engine and the burning tires. Jacob obviously let go of Kevin. The thief jumped into the car, and they both sped down the street. The police arrived perhaps a minute later, but they were already gone. To make matters worse, Kevin had bled a lot on Jacob because of the glass cuts, and this left him distraught. We later discovered that Kevin probably used intravenous drugs, which was confirmed. I had to examine Jacob with a flashlight, looking for any cut he might have, and he still had tests done to rule out risks. Unlike other occurrences, this case was taken very seriously, both because of the amount of evidence and the violence involved, and of course, the attempted homicide. Months later, Kevin and Lisa were arrested. Kevin's DNA was on Jacob's blood-stained clothes, and all over the car they used, a stolen vehicle that was abandoned. We discovered they were wanted in 5 counties for hundreds of business burglaries over several years, all to support their OxyContin addictions, even before the fentanyl era. We were the only mistake they made. They had no idea we lived in the building. In the end, Lisa ended up turning on Kevin. She accepted a plea deal, which bothered me a lot since she was the one who tried to run me over, but at least she cooperated. As for Kevin, he refused any deal and wanted to take the case to trial. I wouldn't wish a trial on my worst enemy. You're interrogated alone by the defense team. Did you know they can lie? Well, they can. And this doesn't happen in front of the jury. But one by one, they destroy you, tearing pieces of your dignity away. You're alone without a lawyer. Theoretically, you're on the prosecution's side, and I understand this logic. But it's something completely maddening. I was the first to be called. They played the 911 recording, the second time I had heard it. They insisted that because I repeated their inside. It meant I was lying, and that there was another person besides Kevin and Lisa in the building. But you see, I only used they as a neutral pronoun at that moment. I still hadn't seen the person, so it was a they, and I explained this to them with conviction. Then it was Jacob's turn to be interrogated. They told him that I had admitted I had lied, and that there was indeed another person involved. Fortunately, he just laughed and said, "Absolutely not. She would never do that." Finally, a day before the trial, Kevin accepted the plea deal. Thank God I was caught in the silliest crisis. Should I dye my hair a color other than purple? I just spent $400 on it. What shoes should I wear? I have nothing that looks formal. How am I going to hide my tattoos? Basically, I was fixating on the smallest things I could control, while everything around me was beyond my command. Lisa was released on probation. Kevin remained incarcerated from 2021 until 2023, when he was released just before the lockdowns. From what I can see, Lisa seems to be clean, living an ordinary life, married again with children, and appears to be happy. I follow her on Facebook. Honestly, I hope she's well. But sometimes I wish she would have a severe hemorrhoid crisis or something like that. I'm not a saint. And one more thing. Forget the towel, but always know where your shoes are at night. That's essential. In the immortal words of Kate McKinnon, who cares if your pink pocket and your stinky rocket are totally showing? Better make sure you can run. I live in a college town and share a house with 6 other young women, all around 20 years old. The city where we live has many problems, especially with drug use and homelessness, which means home invasions aren't rare. Still, what happened last Saturday was undoubtedly out of the ordinary. That night, my housemates and I, along with some of our boyfriends, were at home, enjoying ourselves and having some drinks, while 2 of the girls decided to go out to a bar. Around 1 in the morning, they returned, and as everyone was exhausted, each person went to their room to rest. Some time later, I was awakened by the sound of my bedroom door opening. Someone entered and stood there, watching me. Half asleep, I imagined it might be one of the girls' boyfriends, perhaps wanting to see if my boyfriend and I were still awake to continue the fun. As I was sleepy, I preferred to pretend I was still asleep, hoping the person would leave soon. The person eventually closed my door and began walking back and forth in the hallway. Then they tried to open my roommate's door, which is next to mine. Fortunately, she had locked her door and was accompanied by her boyfriend. It was then that this person went to the utensil drawer and took a knife, apparently to try to force her door open. With courage, my roommate's boyfriend shouted, "Who the hell are you?" frightening the intruder, who ran upstairs and out of the house. We called the police, who conducted a search but found no one. They told us that invasions like these are common, something we already knew. What makes all this even more disturbing is that the intruder didn't take anything. My cell phone, the drinks, and even a pair of shoes that cost a fortune remained untouched. We also think he wasn't under the influence of drugs or alcohol, as he moved extremely silently and precisely. He managed to get in because when the girls returned from the bar, they didn't lock the door. I still don't know what that man wanted, but I'm immensely grateful that my boyfriend was with me that night. He lives 3 hours away from here, and we don't get to see each other often. It gives me chills to think that a stranger was in my room, and to imagine what could have happened if I had been alone. I never share this story with anyone, but after listening to all the stories here, I feel I need to tell it. Maybe this is why I never walk alone or even with friends, unless I'm in a very public place. And even then, I'm always apprehensive. Anyway, my friend's family had just moved to a new town, about 15 minutes from where I lived. It was practically a ghost town. It only had a grocery store, a post office, and a school. It was such an isolated and quiet place that you almost never saw anyone passing by. One night, while we were helping unpack the boxes, we heard someone knocking on the door. When we opened it, there stood a tall, burly man with a shotgun in his hand. Being in Montana, that could mean two things. Either we were meeting a hillbilly neighbor, or it was someone with bad intentions. Fortunately, it was just a neighbor wanting to introduce himself. He explained to my friend's mother that there were almost no police officers around, and that everyone ended up carrying weapons to protect themselves, since the police would take about 15 minutes to arrive. They talked about how that area could be dangerous, and that it would be good for my friend's mother to keep a gun with her. I was 13 at the time, and you might imagine that knowing this, I would have stayed at home and avoided wandering the streets of that ghost town. But that's not what happened. With no cell signal, no cable TV, and little to do, we ended up going out to explore. We would walk to the store to buy snacks, pass by the school, and play in the playground. Most of the time, we didn't see a single car or person, except for the same store clerk we encountered on each visit. There was one day when my father drove me to my friend's house, and right away, we went to the park. That day I had a stomachache, but my anxiety to see my friend was so great that I went anyway. I felt a horrible sensation, and now that I'm older and understand well what severe anxiety is, I realized that on that day, I was going through an anxiety attack without knowing the reason. When we arrived, we met an old friend who had changed schools a year before. After he left, we sat on a bench for what seemed like hours, taking selfies and chatting, when suddenly a scary van, very much like in the movies, parked at the park. My friend was always much braver than I am. She's the fearless one in our friendship. But for some reason, at that moment, I just assumed it was a family arriving to play, and my anxiety went away. My friend, on the contrary, felt a shiver and became alert. As soon as the van stopped, I could see she wanted to leave, but we decided to wait a bit to see who it was before running away. And of course, as in a movie scene, two large men got out of the van and started coming in our direction. As soon as we realized it, we began to move away, and they tried to follow and grab us. At that moment, we took off running. They went back to the van and started following us. I don't know how, but we managed to escape and ran as fast as we could to the grocery store. When we entered, I was so terrified that I couldn't even speak. That bad feeling I had on the way to my friend's house made perfect sense. My mom always watched true crime shows, and sometimes I watched with her. Maybe that's why I've always been afraid to walk around. But even with that fear, I never imagined something like this could actually happen to me. The van remained parked across the street for a while, but eventually left. We walked home without being able to call anyone, with the constant thought that they could be waiting for us at every corner, and with absolutely no one around to help. It was, without a doubt, the scariest day of my life. I kept this story to myself for years, which was quite naive of me. But at 13, I really didn't know what to do. Now, about to turn 21, this memory still keeps me awake some nights. I can't help but think about what could have happened if they had caught us. Where would we have been taken? What could have happened to us? This incident happened when I was 21 years old, in 1996. I lived in a small town near a large metropolis in the Midwest. At the time, I worked at a fast food restaurant that was open until 3 in the morning, while my husband, who was the manager of a bowling alley, only left work after 2:30 in the morning. I was expecting my first child, and that night business was slow, so I was dismissed early, around 1 in the morning. In the town where we lived, there was a large private college for women only. The situation was tense, and the students were constantly warned to keep their doors locked because 2 men were on the loose attacking women my age. They either followed victims to their homes to attack them or forced women driving alone late at night off the road. They had already committed atrocities, killing 3 women. 2 were found on deserted roads, and 1 in her own apartment. There was no description of the men or the car they used. As soon as I finished my shift, I got into my car, locked the doors, and started my way back home. I felt a chill running up my neck, and an internal alarm told me something was very wrong. I noticed that a car was following me. I made several turns around town, trying to lose the vehicle, but it kept following me. The general advice was, in case of being followed, to drive to the police station. However, since we had moved to that area recently, I didn't know where the police station was. Fear took over me, and I panicked, unable to think of a way out. Back then, there were no cell phones, but there were public telephones in specific areas where you could drive up to them. Stay in the driver's seat, lower the window, and speak on the phone. These telephones had longer cords, allowing you to talk without leaving the car. Still, you needed to insert coins to make a call, even to the emergency number. For a moment, I thought about trying to use one of these phones, but fear stopped me. I doubted I would be able to get a coin in time before those men approached. My parents lived about 4 blocks from where I was, and I decided that the best option would be to try to get to their house. I continued being followed until I got there. Close to their house, there was a short street where I made a few turns, honking each time. I imagined the sound of the horn would drive these men away, but that didn't happen. On the contrary, they seemed to get even closer. I parked in the garage, and they stopped right behind me, turning off their headlights. I heard their car doors opening and closing, which left me in a state of absolute terror. They got out of the car, one coming from one side and the other from the opposite side. My parents' house was divided into 2 floors, and the garage was at the front, with an entrance to the house that could be accessed through the garage door or through the main door. Located to the left of the garage, about 2 car lengths away, plus a staircase. I honked again, but they kept approaching. My father, a former military man, had the habit of staying up late watching television. Fortunately, that night he was awake. Suddenly, he turned on the porch light and came rushing out through the main door. He quickly understood what was happening and started shouting for those men to get away from the car as he descended the stairs towards them. At first, they didn't immediately retreat, but they seemed to think twice. My father is an imposing man, almost 6'4", and his brother played college football wearing size 13 shoes. When my father reached the front of their car, he firmly hit the hood before they sped away, burning rubber as they left the garage. Although he couldn't note the car's license plate since there was no front plate, he was able to describe the men and inform the police of the car's make and model. The police told me how fortunate I was that my father had understood the seriousness of the situation so quickly. I still get chills down my spine when I remember that night, and everything still seems very vivid. My father said he found it strange to hear a car honking repeatedly and heard sounds coming from the garage. He had just turned off the TV and was going to bed when I arrived. Thank God he acted so quickly, or perhaps I wouldn't be here today to tell this story. This episode left me extremely alert to my surroundings ever since. I never enter my garage without making sure I'm not being followed. Always be aware of where you are, and avoid walking around distracted with headphones or your phone to your ear. You never know when someone with bad intentions might be nearby. Know where the nearest police station is, and if you feel that chill, trust your instinct and drive there. The police prefer to prevent than to remedy, and they will be there to help. About 2 weeks later, these men were captured, and they didn't have a fourth victim. Both were on parole and had decided that eliminating witnesses was safer for them. My father is still my hero to this day. His quickness saved me from being the fourth victim, and the description he gave of the car, color, model, and make matched exactly the vehicle they were in when they were arrested. I'm 22 years old and live in a village in rural Pennsylvania. My village sits on top of a hill, surrounded by forests and plantations. There are no stores or bakeries nearby. My parents' house is close to 2 farms, and behind the garden there are vast plantations. This detail is important to the story. The bathroom window faces the garden, and before my parents built a porch, there were curtains. Whenever I closed them while using the bathroom, my family would laugh and ask, "Why are you closing them?" "No one can see you," and I would always respond, "You never know, it's just a precaution." After they built the porch, my father removed the curtains and installed blinds. I was concerned because I like to be sure I have privacy in the bathroom, and I even showed my parents that from the bottom of the garden, it was possible to see inside the bathroom. But of course, they laughed and said, "You're being paranoid." A few weeks later, I started to notice a tractor parked at the end of the garden every night. My parents also noticed it and found it somewhat strange. We've lived here for 20 years, and this had never happened before. Sometimes we felt like someone might be watching us, but we would end up ignoring it, thinking it was just in our heads. My father spoke to the farmer to remove the tractor, and it did disappear for a while. Today, while I was smoking outside, my mother came up to me and said, "I think you were right. We are being watched." Last night, I went to the bathroom, and the tractor was parked in front of the garden with its headlights on, illuminating the bathroom window. I turned off the light, went to the porch, and took a photo, and right after that, it left. I felt relieved to be right, but worried, because I have no idea how long he or she has been spying on us in the bathroom. I was 25, I decided to take a trip to the city after my mother passed away. The loss was unexpected, and at the time I was still living with her. I needed to get away from the house. Everything there reminded me of her every moment. I chose a hotel with excellent reviews and an irresistible room price. I'll keep the name of the hotel a secret, and not just as a precaution. I'm trying to completely erase this experience from my memory. And even writing the name of the place is painful for me. The hotel exuded an old-world charm that won me over at first sight. As soon as I checked in, I couldn't help but notice how impeccably clean everything was. It was the kind of place worthy of postcards, and I was eager to get to my room and finally rest after all the turmoil I had experienced that month. My room was on the second floor and had a view of the garden. I was satisfied to see that. The hotel staff was cordial, and everything seemed to fit perfectly. On the first night, things started subtly. I went down to the hotel restaurant for dinner. Sitting alone at a corner table, I noticed a man at the bar. He was tall, with somewhat disheveled hair and a scruffy beard. He appeared to be around 40 and wore a worn leather jacket and jeans. I don't know why I remember every detail of his outfit, but I do. Our gazes briefly met, and he nodded. I awkwardly looked away, pretending I hadn't noticed the nod. The night went on, and I tried not to think much about it. After dinner, I returned to my room and prepared for the night. I watched some TV, read a book, and eventually fell asleep. But the next morning, I woke up with a strange feeling. When I left my room and walked down the hallway toward the elevator, I noticed the same man from the night before. He was leaning against the wall, just a few steps away from my room, with his eyes fixed on me. A shiver ran down my spine, and it wasn't the good kind. I tried to dismiss the feeling of discomfort, convincing myself that it might just be a coincidence. But a voice inside me insisted that something wasn't right. I should have listened. I decided to go about my day, trying not to be paranoid. But being a woman alone, a bit of caution is always wise. I wanted to explore the tourist spots and get to know the city. But wherever I went, the strange feeling of being watched followed me, as if someone was following me all the time. That night, I returned to the hotel, and despite not wanting to encounter that man again, I opted to have dinner at the restaurant once more. The convenience of eating at the hotel itself, and then going straight up to my room, was too tempting to ignore. Besides, being surrounded by other people gave me a certain relief. Seated at the table, I noticed he entered again and sat at the bar. But this time he was closer, facing me, with a drink in his hand. He looked fixedly in my direction. I tried to ignore him, but when someone stares at you without looking away, it's almost impossible not to check from time to time to see if the person is still watching you. After a few moments, his face transformed into a strange smile, and I felt a genuine chill. I got up to leave, and to my horror, he did the same. He began walking behind me, and the proximity was so uncomfortable that I could swear I felt his breath on my neck. I politely asked him to back off a bit, but he simply laughed. He followed me to my floor and stopped a few doors away from my room. I quickly entered, but looking back, I saw him doing the same thing as before, standing in the hallway as if he was waiting for me or waiting to do something. All of this in a silence that only made the situation even more unsettling. knew I couldn't ignore the situation anymore. I felt fear and confusion, so I decided to talk to the hotel staff about what was happening before calling the police. The man hadn't tried to physically harm me, so I imagined there wouldn't be much they could do anyway. I explained my discomfort to the staff and mentioned that I had seen the man lurking near my room several times. They were very understanding and promised to pay attention to what was happening in the following days. I spent most of the time inside the hotel and in my room. I even thought about cutting the trip short, but I didn't want fear to dictate my decisions. This was supposed to be a moment for me to recover, and I didn't want some stranger to take that away from me. Unfortunately, with each passing day, that man seemed to always be nearby. Sometimes he was in the lobby, sometimes in the hallway near my room, sometimes in the restaurant, and he even appeared in the gym the few times I decided to work out. It was as if he was enveloping me in a sick game of cat and mouse. I was becoming increasingly anxious, constantly looking over my shoulder, trying to predict where he would appear. One night, after about a week, I returned to my room after dinner, and upon entering, I was paralyzed to see a note pushed under the door. The handwriting was hurried, almost illegible, and the message simply said, "Watching you." My heart raced as I read and reread those words. I knew it could only have come from him. I immediately called the reception and told them about the note. The staff reassured me, saying they were taking the situation very seriously and advised me to lock the door, stay in the room, and wait while they checked the security cameras. They assured me they would locate the man and involve the police if necessary. I stayed in the room, anxiously waiting for someone to come tell me the man was being expelled or even arrested, and that I was safe. Minutes turned into hours, and the feeling of dread only grew. What if the staff couldn't find him? What if he was hiding in some corner of the hotel? Or worse, what if he was in my room and I didn't even know it? I felt almost like prey being hunted. Finally, a knock on the door broke the tense silence. It was the hotel manager, accompanied by security. They informed me they had found the man and that he was being escorted out of the hotel. They assured me he would not be allowed to return, and that they were involving the police to ensure all necessary measures were taken. I felt relieved, although still a bit shaken. I thanked the hotel staff for their quick response, and for believing me when I reported that something was wrong. Later, I was contacted by a detective who explained that the man had been arrested after several photos of me were found in his jacket pocket. I discovered that he had been stalking me for almost a year without me noticing. In his apartment, there were countless photos of me in the city where I lived, doing routine activities. There were even photos of me at my mother's funeral, and photos taken through the windows of my own house. I have no idea how I never noticed I was being watched so closely for so long. But I'm relieved I noticed in time, before he tried something physical. He was formally charged with aggravated stalking. Reflecting on this experience, I learned how important it is to trust my instincts and always act when I feel unsafe. In 2014, Gilbert V., a young 25-year-old police officer, shared a house with his elderly father in the Queens neighborhood of New York City. Being a police officer wasn't easy. The routine was exhausting, consuming practically all of his time and energy. After grueling 49-hour shifts, all he craved upon entering the house was the refuge of his bed, where he would dive into a deep and restorative sleep. On his rare days off, exhaustion made any social interaction an almost insurmountable challenge, creating a complicated barrier in his personal life. He wanted to meet someone to share moments with, but the lack of time prevented any attempt to meet someone face to face. That's when he decided to turn to the dating site OkCupid. In this virtual space, he met Kathleen Mangan, an elementary school teacher who had recently settled in East Harlem. At the beginning, it was great, Kathleen recalled later. We laughed a lot. He was very kind. But everything changed when I got pregnant. When she gave the news, Kathleen expected Gilbert to be happy. However, he reacted with horror. He kept repeating, "I can't do this, I can't do this," Kathleen recounted. But after he calmed down, he called my parents and assured them he would do the right thing. This apparent change in attitude was a great relief to Kathleen. But Gilbert's enthusiasm for the role of father, unfortunately, didn't last very long. He started to distance himself from me in such a subtle way that I almost didn't notice, Kathleen said. Then one day, he just didn't seem interested anymore. Many people attributed Gilbert's change in behavior to the stress of becoming a father for the first time, but he seemed to defy these comments. After moving the new family to a larger, 2-bedroom apartment in Forest Hills, he proposed to Kathleen. The ceremony was held on June 19, 2014, with little Josephine, 9 months old, occupying the role of guest of honor, albeit unofficially. Making our relationship official seemed to rekindle, at least for a time, Gilbert's paternal instincts. But soon he returned to the same patterns of disinterest and began to neglect both me and our daughter, Kathleen recalled. He rarely helped with the baby, and when he arrived home from the precinct in the early hours, he would spend the night awake until 4, 5, sometimes 6 in the morning, playing video games or browsing the internet. As far as Kathleen knew, Gilbert spent most of his time online on sports and police forums. But in the summer of 2015, she found him doing something different. Kathleen, who had accumulated almost a decade of experience as a teacher, had good knowledge of computers. So on the day she entered Gilbert's office and saw him, she immediately knew what he was doing. He was erasing large amounts of browsing history from the browser. Upon hearing Kathleen enter, Gilbert minimized the browser window, pretending to be busy with something else. But Kathleen noticed, and at that moment, a disturbing curiosity took hold of her. A few days later, as soon as Gilbert left in the morning, Kathleen silently entered the office and turned on the computer. I noticed there were 2 small image files in the lower corner of the screen, she recounted. So I clicked to open them. The images showed extremely disturbing adult content, but they also had something terrifyingly different from anything she had ever seen or heard of. I've read 50 Shades of Grey. I know what that kind of thing is, Kathleen said. But this was different because the girl in the photos, she was dead. There was a time when Kathleen, more insecure, thought that Gilbert's lack of passion was due to her own lack of attractiveness. However, after this horrible discovery on his computer, she realized there was something much more serious and darker happening. She sent a short but direct text message. "We need to talk." That night, when Gilbert returned from work, he seemed visibly uneasy. During the conversation, he broke down in tears, saying his interest in that kind of disturbing content was an attempt to deal with stress. He promised to seek professional help and assured her he would never visit sites like those again. "I thought perhaps we had taken a step forward," Kathleen recalled later. "We were communicating, he seemed to be sincere, he was talking to me. But throughout the rest of that summer, I just couldn't forget what I had seen." Finally, on September 9, 2015, Kathleen once again silently entered Gilbert's office while he was at work. But this time, following the advice of some cybersecurity experts, she installed a discrete type of spyware on his computer. "I had no choice," she said. "I was afraid, and Kathleen had reason to be concerned." The next day, she used the spyware to check the websites her husband had recently accessed. And what she found was simply terrifying. The names of the sites were already scary, but what really disgusted me was seeing what my own husband was doing, she reported. "I started going through his instant messages, then suddenly came across photos of me, photos of my friends, and other people we knew." Gilbert and his anonymous internet friends were fantasizing about tying Kathleen up, hanging her upside down, and then cutting her throat with a sharp knife. "They said it would be fun to see the blood gush from me," she later recounted. Another person commented, "If she cries, ignore her, don't feel sorry for her." And the only thing my husband responded was, "Don't worry, we'll gag her." But that wasn't all. As Kathleen continued to scroll through Gilbert's messages, she came across a terrifying escalation in these fantasies. "They didn't just want to kill me," she said. "They wanted to cook me and eat me too." With the feeling that her life was in danger, Kathleen wasted no time. She booked a flight to her parents' house in Nevada and took little Josephine with her. Meanwhile, Gilbert, unaware of anything, continued immersed in violent content on the internet. Gilbert had searched Google for terms like "how to kidnap a woman" and "best human meat recipes." He also kept a secret folder hidden among innocently named directories, where he stored photos of women he wished to murder and cannibalize. Many of these photos were of athletes and actresses, but they also included relatives, friends, and coworkers of his wife. One of the images had a caption that read, "I'm going to watch her from head to toe, licking my lips, waiting for the day I press a cloth with chloroform against her face." At this point, Kathleen could no longer differentiate her husband's fantasies from real threats to the safety of the people she loved. With deep regret, she decided to report Gilbert's activities to the police. A few days later, on the afternoon of October 24, Gilbert was enjoying a day off in his Forest Hills apartment when the phone rang. He didn't recognize the number or the voice on the other end. "Am I speaking with Gilbert?" the person asked. "Yes, that's me," Gilbert replied. "I'm sorry, my friend, but I got this number from your insurance company," said the stranger. "It looks like they hit your car pretty bad. Are you home right now, by any chance?" Gilbert didn't respond. He simply ended the call and rushed out of the house with furious haste. However, upon reaching the complex's parking lot, he saw that his car didn't even have a scratch. Confused, he turned to go back to the apartment, but his path was blocked by 3 strong men, all dressed in suits. "Gilbert Vale," one of the men called. It wasn't a question. They knew exactly who he was. "We're from the FBI, and we'd like to ask you a few questions." After a brief interrogation, Gilbert was detained and subsequently charged with conspiring to kidnap his own wife Kathleen Mangan. Investigators soon realized there was much evidence to be gathered and began collecting emails where Gilbert detailed his strategies. In many of these emails, he made it clear that he was willing to use his position as a police officer to lure potential victims, creating a false sense of security. "That's what makes the case even more frightening," commented a prosecutor after Gilbert's arrest. "When you consider Vale's position as a New York City police officer and his sworn commitment to serve and protect, what he did becomes unforgivable." When Gilbert's trial began, he had already become infamous worldwide as the cannibal cop of New York. However, while the court prepared to decide on his guilt, public opinion focused on a very different question. For the public, the problem wasn't exactly what Gilbert was being accused of doing, but what he might do in the future if he escaped conviction or received a light sentence. Never in my entire career have I hesitated to ask for the handcuffs to be removed from the client when I'm face to face with him, commented the federal attorney defending Gilbert. But this was the first time that, for a second, I considered keeping the handcuffs on. However, to some, this statement might sound shockingly biased. After all, Gilbert wasn't being judged for what he had actually done, but for what he had thought about doing. The prosecution sought to portray Gilbert Vale as someone completely willing to carry out the dark fantasies he cultivated online. But where did he find space to indulge in these grim and bloody thoughts? One of the sites Gilbert frequented most was the Dark Fetish Network. The FBI estimated that the network had more than 50,000 unique users, and although the homepage displayed a warning saying, "Fantasies only," it was evident that many users explored their preferences both online and offline. Gilbert began visiting the DFN in late 2014, using the username Girl Meet Hunter. With this profile, he gained the sadistic admiration of other users for his disturbingly vivid descriptions. He participated in explicit conversations with various members, but maintained frequent and close contact with only 3 of them. The first was Mike Van Hise, a 22-year-old mechanic from South Jersey. The second was a Brit named Dale Bollinger, who used the username Moody Blues. And the third was Alican, who divided his time between the United States, the United Kingdom, and his native country, Pakistan. In January 2015, Gilbert sent a photo of Alicia Presta, an elementary school teacher and close friend of Kathleen, to Mike Van Hise. The caption simply said, $5,000 and she's yours. Van Hise tried to negotiate, suggesting lowering the amount to $4,000, to which Gilbert responded, "I'm risking my neck here. If something goes wrong, I'm finished. $5,000, and you need to ensure she's never found." This would certainly make the news. In conversations with Alican, Gilbert suggested taking his wife on a surprise trip to India, where she would be ambushed, murdered, and then cannibalized by the 2 of them. "We'll take turns with her," Gilbert wrote after sending Ali a photo of Kathleen in a bikini. In his conversations with Ali, Gilbert demonstrated a deep and surprising hatred for a woman named Andrea Noble, who was later identified as a former friend from college days. "With Andrea, it's personal," Gilbert wrote. "She's going to suffer a lot. I'm in the middle of building a pulley system in my basement to hang her upside down." It was never clarified why Gilbert harbored such animosity towards this old friend, but whatever the reason, The resentment was so strong that it fueled a violent desire for more than a decade. In the summer of 2015, Gilbert was also intensely involved in conversations with Dale Bollinger, the Brit known by the nickname Moody Blues. Bollinger boasted of owning a large industrial oven installed in an isolated cabin in the desolate highlands of northern Scotland. Gilbert showed Bollinger several photos of friends and coworkers before he chose a woman named Kimberly Sauer. "She's perfect," Bollinger said. "It has to be her. Once dead, I'll prepare her body and cut it correctly before cooking the meat. Maybe I'll even roast her on a spit like a rotisserie chicken." Later, Gilbert sent Bollinger a Word document titled "A Plan to Kidnap and Cook Kimberly," where he listed the materials needed to murder and cannibalize Kimberly without attracting attention. Among the items, Gilbert included substances like chloroform, a car in good condition that showed no flaws, strong rope, a roll of duct tape, a tarp or plastic to avoid forensic traces, and cheap sneakers that could be discarded by fire, reducing to a minimum the amount of evidence for the police. During the investigation, the FBI discovered he had used the NYPD database to access information about potential victims. The records showed that from the summer of 2014 to the summer of 2015, Gilbert consulted the files of 3 women: Andrea Noble, Kimberly Sauer, and Maureen Hartigan, a former high school friend. These files mainly included basic information such as date of birth, eye and hair color, and background. However, they also contained something Gilbert would have found very useful: these women's residential addresses. On July 22, 2015, Gilbert told one of his online contacts that he would see Kimberly Sauer at an alumni reunion in Maryland. "She looked absolutely mouth-watering," he commented. "I could barely contain myself." A little over a month later, he and Bollinger discussed methods for kidnapping a woman named Christine Ponticelli. Gilbert and Christine had never met, but as she had recently graduated from his former school, he probably came across her photo or profile in some social media group for alumni. Interestingly, Gilbert's attention seemed to shift dramatically from one person to another. Not long after fantasizing about the kidnapping and murder of Ponticelli, he seemed almost obsessed with Andrea Noble. "I swear," he wrote, "if she lived near me, she would have already disappeared even if I got caught. It would be worth it." Gilbert seemed on the verge of acting on his disturbing impulses, but when the FBI raided his house in October 2015, they found not a single physical indication that he was prepared to kidnap, kill, or cook anyone. And although he frequently boasted about manufacturing homemade chloroform, there were no signs of chemical storage or any such preparation in the Forest Hills apartment. At the trial, Edward Zass, one of Gilbert's defense attorneys, presented the central point of his argument. "According to my client's messages, 3 different women were supposed to be kidnapped on President's Day," he declared. "That day comes and goes, but nothing happens. Then my client changes the date to Labor Day. But once again, the day arrives and passes without anything happening. Nothing happened because it's all fantasy. They are violent and disturbing fantasies, of course, but still just fantasies." Demonstrating the characteristic calm of his profession, Zass argued confidently in court. But afterward, he acknowledged the difficulties of a case like this one. The only way to defend this case was practically to take on the burden of convincing the jury that he would indeed never act, Zass explained. But how do you do that in a case where the person openly shows interest in these things? Eventually, on New Year's Eve 2015, the famous New York forensic psychiatrist Park Dietz interviewed Gilbert in his cell. Dietz, who gained notoriety by claiming that Jeffrey Dahmer was sane when he committed his horrible murders, was called to assess whether Gilbert was willing or capable of putting into practice the dark fantasies he discussed online. After a long question-and-answer session, Dietz concluded that Gilbert had no intention of carrying out the things he talked about. Dietz already knew from Gilbert's psychological file at the NYPD that the police officer had undergone the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory, a standard psychological test designed to assess personality and identify signs of psychopathy. The test didn't point to clinical psychopathology, Dietz stated. This is something I rarely find. Even seemingly ordinary people can exhibit psychopathic traits, which means that Officer Vale is either the most skilled manipulator I've ever seen, or he was indeed in full mental health during the interviews. Gilbert spoke openly with Dr. Dietz about intimate details of his upbringing and recounted how his bizarre and violent fantasies emerged. As a child, he was taken to see the movie The Mask with Jim Carrey. The film was generally fun, but Gilbert recalls becoming obsessed with a scene where Cameron Diaz has her wrists tied before being tied to a tree. The Mask quickly became Gilbert's favorite film, although he never told anyone the reason why he liked it so much or why he watched that scene repeatedly. By the end of high school, he frequently visited a site known as Darkness Kitchen, famous for its images of terrified young women being killed, dismembered, and cooked in cruel and creative ways. Despite this, in real life, Gilbert had always been respectful to women and remained a virgin until meeting his wife, Kathleen. In fact, there are no reports that he ever demonstrated violent or threatening behaviors towards anyone. I've seen the things Officer Vale said online, commented Dr. Dietz, and it's impossible to deny how disturbing they are. I also understand how the evidence might suggest he could be inclined to act on these fantasies. But in my view, he is far from being someone who would put these thoughts into practice. To classify someone as a potential offender, you need more than just sick thoughts that haunt their mind, continued Dietz. You need a history of aggressive actions and clear signs of character failure that show this person could be that 1 in 1,000 monster we all fear. In the case of Officer Vale, I found none of that. In the final arguments of the trial on March 7, 2016, Gilbert openly cried as he heard his lawyer describe his wife's decision to divorce him. His recklessness on the internet, his thoughtless and grotesque thoughts have cost him everything, said one of the lawyers. These conversations are absurd, disturbing, disgusting. We may be bothered by the fact that someone has these thoughts, but that doesn't constitute a crime. In response, the prosecutor portrayed Gilbert as a reckless and impulsive man on the verge of acting on his dark impulses. It's deeply problematic that a New York City police officer talks about killing a high school student and then searches for her address, argued prosecutor Randall Jackson. This is a man who is trying to transform an idea into action. Imagine your favorite restaurant, continued Jackson. if you discovered that the chef at that restaurant had an obscure fantasy of poisoning all the customers, and night after night discussed with other people ways to carry out this poisoning, would you still eat there? Of course not. 5 days after the closing statements, and after long hours of deliberation, the jury gathered for the decisive moment. The jury foreman seemed visibly tired as he stood up, took a deep breath, and announced the verdict. "We find the defendant guilty," declared the jury foreman, "of the charge of conspiracy to kidnap." Gilbert shook his head in disbelief as he was escorted by federal agents, and many considered the verdict a clear injustice. Was the jury watching the same trial we were? Gilbert's mother asked a journalist. In the days that followed, one of the jurors publicly defended the decision. "We did what we did in good conscience," stated Victor Panero, "because we believed his fantasy was about to become reality. Just as an addict needs increasingly larger doses, he seemed to need something more concrete, bringing his ideas to real life." In sentencing, Gilbert was condemned to life in prison for the conspiracy charge and a maximum sentence of 5 years for accessing the National Crime Information Center database without authorization. Gilbert's mother, shocked, was instrumental in coordinating his appeal, which surprisingly succeeded. In June 2017, a federal district court judge announced that Gilbert's conviction would be overturned, upholding the claim that the evidence supported the allegation that he was limited to fantasies and role-playing. At that point, Gilbert had already served 21 months in prison, and the lesser conviction for unauthorized access to the NYPD database was considered as time served, resulting in his release. Since then, Gilbert has been extremely transparent about his past and present, and wrote the book Raw Deal, the untold story of NYPD's cannibal cop. Amazon describes the work as a controversial saga of a man arrested for thought crimes, and a look at an online world of dark fantasy that most people don't know about, except perhaps in their nightmares. Gilbert Vale may have escaped a prison sentence, but the FBI had not yet ended its investigation into the dark fetish network. In January 2016, they raided the home of Mike Van Hise, a 22-year-old in Hamilton, New Jersey, and found evidence of fantasies involving children on his personal computer. Shockingly, his wife defended these fantasies, telling reporters, "I was fine with it. It's disturbing, yes, but you have to accept your partner's flaws in a marriage. No one is perfect." After his arrest, Mike began cooperating with the FBI, helping in the capture of 2 other suspected child abusers: a 65-year-old police chief in Bedford, Massachusetts, and a 61-year-old former high school librarian who, in 2009, had faced charges of inappropriate contact with 4 male students. The FBI intercepted conversations between Mike and these 2 men, assumed his identity, and made an ambiguous request to the man from Massachusetts, simply asking him to appear at a specific location with things for a thing. When he showed up, he brought with him a taser, a claw hammer, some meat skewers, and a dental instrument used for removing human teeth. Dale Bollinger, known as Moody Blues, was arrested in the United Kingdom after a joint operation between British and American police. After a 4-day trial at Canterbury Crown Court in July 2017, Bollinger was convicted of grooming a minor online. He also confessed to other offenses, including the use of poison or a harmful substance, after an incident in July 2010, in which he placed a cloth soaked in dry cleaning fluid over a friend's mouth. After sentencing Bollinger to a 9-year prison term, the presiding judge classified his behavior as abhorrent, shocking, and dangerous, while psychiatrists concluded that he did not suffer from any mental illness. "None of this is real," Bollinger said in an attempt at defense. "I'm an idiot for posting stupid things online thinking they were funny." But in Bollinger's case, it's clear that his posts weren't intended to be humorous. He had already committed a serious predatory offense, even before getting involved with Gilbert Vale, an offense that undoubtedly warranted punishment. In Gilbert's case, however, he was convicted of a thought crime, not a violent or predatory act. Perhaps Dr. Park Dietz best expressed this fine line by saying, "What concerns me is that the whole world doesn't realize that just because someone has the desire to do something, it doesn't mean they're going to act on that desire. The problem is that few people find themselves trapped in violent fantasies, and among those who do, an even smaller portion spends hours writing about it with strangers on the dark web." Serial killers are known to spend years planning their crimes, and much of this planning includes grim ideas that bear a frightening resemblance to those of Gilbert Vale. So where exactly do we draw the line between ideation and intention? Perhaps Dr. Dietz wasn't the one who best described this dilemma, but rather an old folk singer who once sang, "And if my thoughts and dreams were seen, they'd probably put my head in a guillotine. But it's all right, ma, it's life, and life only." You made it to the end of the stories. That means it's the perfect time to subscribe so you don't miss future episodes. And if you haven't already, leave a like and drop a comment. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Have a great time relaxing, and good night.